Every Sith Lord who ever lived died screaming, or died broken, or died alone on a cold world with a Jedi blade in their chest. Every single one, without exception. 5,000 years of the dark side, and not one of them found a way out. Karness Muur looked at that record and decided it was an engineering problem, not a destiny. The world did not have a name yet. The Republic's cartographers had not reached this far. The Jedi had no temple here, no outpost, no record of the system in any archive that would survive the next 1,000 years. The planet was cold and dark, with a dense atmosphere and a single large continent pressed against its northern hemisphere like a hand laid flat against a table. There were forests. There were rivers that ran the color of iron in the low light of the system's distant sun. There were no cities. There were structures, low, heavy buildings cut from the native stone, without windows, without the kind of ornamentation that spoke to comfort or pride. They were built by people who were not interested in those things. They were built by people who were interested in surviving. In one of those buildings, in a room at its center with no door, only a curved wall that opened and closed like a mouth if you knew exactly where to press, Karness Muur was working. He had been working for 18 months. Before that, he had been planning for 11 years. Before that, he had been afraid. The fear had not started as a general feeling. Muur did not suffer from vague unease. Everything he experienced precisely. The fear began during a skirmish in the Stygian caldera, a minor engagement by the standards of what the dark side exiles had been surviving since their expulsion from the Republic, when a Jedi blade opened a cut along his forearm that was not deep enough to be serious. He healed it himself. That was routine. What was not routine was what he noticed 3 days later. The healing was slower than it should have been. He was 53 years old. For a human living an ordinary life, that was not a significant age. For a Sith Lord who had spent 30 years burning through Force energy at the rate required to survive exile, war, internal Sith politics, and the Jedi's unending campaign to exterminate the dark side exiles, 53 was old. The body had a fixed account, and Muur had been withdrawing from it in large, irregular amounts since the age of 22. He understood this clearly. He was not afraid of being 53. He was afraid of what 53 meant in terms of direction. He could see where the line was going. He could see where it ended. Ajunta Paul did not have this problem. Paul was the greatest of them, the most powerful of all the exiles, the one whose command of the dark side was so complete it looked effortless from the outside. Muur had spent decades studying Paul and had never been able to replicate what he saw. Paul moved through the Force with a kind of brute certainty that made everything flow downhill around him. Muur had no such certainty. What Muur had was precision. He could see the structure of things. He could see his own structure, and what he saw was the beginning of its end. Other Sith, in his position, would have fought harder, taken more, pushed the dark side further, trying to extract more power from the years remaining. Muur did not do that. He sat down and thought for 11 years instead. What he thought about was the problem of the self. The Sith had always understood that the self did not have to end when the body ended. The techniques were old, older than the exile, older than the 100-year darkness that had produced the exile. Sith spirits could be preserved, anchored to tombs or objects of tremendous dark side power, maintained through ritual and the tending of followers. The knowledge existed. The practice existed. Muur had spent time in the presence of older spirits preserved this way. What he sensed from them was not continuity. It was echo. The same patterns, repeating. The same thoughts, compressed into loops. A spirit was not a person. It was a recording of a person, sophisticated, sometimes interactive, but fundamentally static. It could not grow. It could not adapt. It sat in its tomb and repeated itself until no one came to listen anymore. That was not survival. That was a long, slow version of death with more steps. What Muur wanted was transfer. True transfer. His consciousness moved from his aging body into a new one, and then a new one after that, indefinitely, for as long as the galaxy produced suitable hosts. The Sith had attempted versions of this before. They had always failed in the same way. Something broke during the transfer. Something fragmented. The coherence of the mind, the specific, irreducible architecture of a particular self, could not survive the crossing intact. What arrived in the new body was diminished, distorted. Not the original person, but a damaged copy, aware of its own damage, unable to repair it. In the 11th year of thinking about this problem, Muur arrived at a solution. An intermediate object. Not a tomb, not a location. A portable thing, small enough to carry, durable enough to outlast ordinary destruction. Something that could hold a compressed fragment of his consciousness. Not everything, but the essential core. The processing architecture of his mind, reduced and sealed inside matter that he would treat with Sith alchemy until the boundary between the matter and the mind became, for practical purposes, meaningless. The object would carry him. When the right host came along, force-sensitive, powerful, with defenses that could be worn down through sustained contact, the fragment would transfer. The host would think they were putting on a piece of jewelry. What would actually be happening was that Karness Muur would begin the process of making their mind into his. The idea itself was not entirely new. The execution was new. And execution, Muur had always believed, was the only part that mattered. The metal came from a meteorite. He had been specific about the source. It needed to come from outside any system he had lived or worked in. The reasoning was part alchemical, part instinct. He did not want the metal carrying prior associations. He wanted it empty, a blank vessel, holding nothing, waiting to hold one specific thing. He wanted to be the first presence it knew. The meteorite had been recovered from a dead star system by a follower named Trisk, who had force-tracking abilities and an obsessive interest in astronomical debris. Trisk had spent 4 months locating the right specimen based on Muur's specifications. The metal was dark, nearly black in most lighting, with a faint blue-gray quality when held directly under the kind of harsh overhead light Muur used in his workroom. It was dense. A piece the size of a fist was heavier than it looked. It had a particular coldness to it that did not come entirely from temperature. Muur had the meteorite cut down. He worked the metal himself, which was not how Sith Lords typically operated. Most would have directed followers to do the physical labor. Muur did not trust this work to other hands. The shaping took 6 weeks. The final form was small enough to sit in a closed palm without the fingers fully closing. It was flat on one side and slightly convex on the other. There was nothing decorative about it. No markings, no inlaid symbols, no concession to the aesthetic traditions of Sith artifact making, which tended toward the ornate. The talisman looked like a piece of dark stone that someone had smoothed. That was intentional. The most important thing Muur had ever made was going to look like something you could find on any riverbank on any unremarkable world in the galaxy. The alchemical working began in the 3rd month and did not stop. Sith alchemy was not a single technique. It was a category, a broad collection of methods for using the dark side to alter matter at a fundamental level, changing what something was made of, what it could do, what it could hold. Muur had studied it for 30 years. He was, by the time of this work, one of the foremost practitioners alive. What he was attempting had no exact precedent, which meant he had no existing method to follow, and no guarantee that any approach he tried would produce the result he needed. He worked systematically. He worked through failure after failure, 17 distinct approaches over 18 months, each of which produced something, but not the right something. The metal changed under his work. It became more dense, in ways that did not register on physical scales. It became colder in ways that did not respond to heat. It began to hold the dark side the way certain stones hold water, not actively, not through any process, but simply because their structure had become suited to it. By the 15th month, he could press a fragment of his attention into the metal and feel it hold. By the 17th month, he could press something deeper, not attention, but presence. The specific quality of his awareness, the particular texture of his mind, held inside the metal the way a voice is held inside a recording crystal, except that what was held was not a recording. It was alive, reduced, compressed, constrained, but alive. By the 18th month, he was done. He wore it for the first time on a morning when the iron-colored rivers outside were running high from 3 days of rain. He held it in his hand for a long time first, turning it over. The convex side fit naturally against his palm. It was cold, as it always was. He put it on. He had made a simple cord for it from material that would not degrade, and let it rest against his chest. He felt himself inside it. Not completely. The fragment was small. It was compressed. It was not the full experience of being Karness Muur. It was more like a concentrated version of him, stripped of the ordinary daily texture of thought and reduced to the essential core. But it was him. He recognized it the way a person recognizes their own reflection, even distorted. He stood in his workroom for a long time after that. Then he began testing what it could do. The Rakghoul plague was not an accident. The talisman's second function, the one that would define its reputation across the centuries, emerged during the testing period. When Muur wore the talisman and focused its energy outward toward non-force sensitives in his proximity, those individuals changed. It happened within hours. The change was not subtle. They became something other than what they had been, savage, mindless, bound to the talisman's wearer in a way that had nothing to do with loyalty or training. They became extensions of the talisman's will, which was Muur's will, compressed and emanating outward through the dark metal. He had not planned this specific outcome. He had expected the talisman to function primarily as a vessel and a transfer mechanism. The plague effect was a consequence of the alchemy, a side product of the dark side energy the talisman radiated continuously into its environment. Muur examined it carefully, decided it was useful, and incorporated it into his understanding of what he had made. An army that required no recruitment, no pay, no loyalty, only proximity. He spent the next 2 years using both functions, wearing the talisman, testing the transfer against various force-sensitive subjects, refining his understanding of which types of minds resisted longest and which yielded fastest. He did not succeed in a full transfer during this period. The resistance problem remained. Force sensitives with strong training could hold against the compression indefinitely. He needed a host whose defenses were either absent or already worn down. He needed to be patient. Muur had always been patient. The Jedi came before he found the right host. They came in numbers, a coordinated strike, not a single hunter. Someone in the Republic's intelligence network had located the unnamed world. Someone had understood, at least partially, what Muur had built there. The strike was designed to eliminate him before the talisman could be used at full capacity. It nearly worked. The battle lasted 2 days. Muur's followers, some of them already partially changed by the talisman's continuous radiation, fought with the particular ferocity of people who no longer had the instinct for self-preservation. The Jedi lost more of their number than they had expected to lose. But there were more of them than there were of Muur's people, and by the end of the second day, Muur was the last one standing. And then he was not standing. He died the way the record said Sith Lords died, on a cold floor, in a building cut from native stone, with a Jedi blade that had entered through his side and done the work that Jedi blades were designed to do. It was not a slow death. He had always thought he would have more time at the end. Time to think, to make arrangements, to do something with the final minutes. He did not. The end came faster than he had calculated. But the talisman was around his neck when he died. The fragment of his consciousness inside it was sealed completely. It did not diminish when his body stopped. It did not dissipate. It sat inside the cold, dark metal, and it waited, the way it had been built to wait, for the next hand that was warm enough and sensitive enough and close enough to reach for it. The Jedi who found his body took the talisman off carefully, without touching it with bare skin. They had been briefed. They knew what it was, at least in outline. They placed it in a sealed container and carried it away from the unnamed world, intending to bring it to a facility where it could be studied and contained properly. They did not reach that facility. The details of what happened to the transport are not recorded clearly. What is recorded is that the talisman passed from the Jedi's hands into the hands of a group of surviving Sith followers within 6 months of Muur's death. Followers who had been trailing the transport, who understood enough of what their master had built to know it needed to be recovered, but who did not understand enough to know what recovering it would eventually cost them. They carried it to a sealed chamber on a world that was already being abandoned, a world the Sith were withdrawing from as the Jedi pressure intensified across that region of space. They placed it in the chamber. They sealed the chamber. They left, intending to return. Most of them did not return. The talisman sat in the dark. It was cold, as it always was. It was small, as it had always been. Inside it, compressed and patient and completely still, something waited for the next person who would be foolish enough, or desperate enough, or simply unlucky enough to pick it up. It had no opinion about how long that would take. It had nothing but time. There is a specific kind of ambition that does not know it is small. It feels enormous from the inside. It fills the chest. It makes a 23-year-old walk into a sealed chamber on an abandoned world and reach for something that killed the last person who reached for it, and the person before that, and the person before that, and feel, in the moment of reaching, nothing but certainty. That certainty is the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. Not the dark side, not Sith Lords, not ancient alchemical talismans sealed inside cold black metal. The certainty of a young person who has never been wrong about anything important yet. His name does not survive. This is not unusual for the era. The old Sith Wars produced thousands of casualties on both sides. Jedi, Sith, soldiers, civilians, and the record-keeping of the period was inconsistent at best, deliberately destroyed at worst. The Jedi burned Sith libraries when they found them. The Sith burned Republic archives when they could reach them. What survived was fragmentary, partial, full of gaps. A 23-year-old acolyte of no particular rank and no particular fame was exactly the kind of person the historical record was not designed to preserve.
What can be reconstructed about him comes from 3 sources: a partial scroll recovered from a Sith library on a world the Jedi scorched circa 4820 BB, which contains a reference to a young tracker of Sith relics operating in the Outer Rim, a secondary reference in a different text that mentions the same individual by a title rather than a name, the young one who follows old metal, which was apparently how his contemporaries described his specific obsession, and the physical evidence of the talisman itself, which carries the first mark he left on it in the form of a crack along its upper face that was not there when Muur died.
These 3 fragments, assembled, Produce an outline of a person. Not a full picture, an outline. He was young. He was force-sensitive with genuine ability. The first text describes his tracking skill in terms that suggest real talent, not merely enthusiasm. He had been operating alone for at least 2 years before he found the chamber, which meant he was self-sufficient in ways that most acolytes his age were not. He had a particular focus on relics from the earliest period of the Sith exile, the generation of Ajunta Paul and Karness Muur, and had apparently spent years accumulating references to the talisman from whatever sources he could find. He knew what it was. That is important. He was not walking in blind. He walked in anyway. The world where the chamber was located had been largely abandoned for nearly 2 centuries by the time he arrived. The Sith withdrawal from that region of space had been gradual but complete, driven by the sustained Jedi pressure that followed Muur's death and the deaths of several other major Sith figures in the same decade. The buildings that remained were intact but empty. The stone held. The roofs had not collapsed. The iron-colored rivers still ran in the low light, though there was no one left to see them. The world was exactly what it had been when Muur worked there. Cold, dark, dense atmosphered, except that now it was also silent. The acolyte arrived by a small, unremarkable ship that he landed in a clearing near the main cluster of structures. He had been to this world once before, briefly, on a preliminary survey that he had not told anyone about. He had located the outer structure of the sealed chamber during that visit, but had not attempted to open it. He had gone back to his sources, confirmed what he believed was inside, and then returned with the specific knowledge of how the wall mechanism worked, pressure points in a sequence, derived from a description in the half-burned scroll. He was methodical. This is worth noting. He was not reckless in his preparation. He had done the work. He understood the theory of what the talisman was and what it could do. He had read, in the fragmentary, damaged texts available to him, accounts of Muur's ability to transfer his presence into hosts. He knew the talisman carried something of Muur inside it. He believed, with the complete confidence of someone who has never tested a belief against reality, that he could manage that presence. That his training, his natural ability, his careful preparation would be sufficient defense against something that had been specifically engineered to defeat exactly those defenses. He pressed the wall in the correct sequence. It opened. The chamber inside was exactly as the followers had left it 2 centuries earlier. The sealed container that held the talisman sat on a low stone shelf along the far wall. The air inside was stale in a way that suggested complete isolation, not merely closed, but sealed against any exchange with the outside. The acolyte stood in the entrance for a moment, adjusting to the quality of the dark. He had a light source. He used it. The container was not elaborate. It was a simple box of the same dark stone as the walls, with a fitted lid that required no mechanism to open, just lifting. The Sith followers who had placed it there had not had the time or resources for anything more sophisticated. They had been withdrawing under pressure. They had done what they could. He lifted the lid. The talisman was inside, resting on a piece of fabric that had partially deteriorated over 2 centuries into a fine dark powder. The talisman itself had not deteriorated at all. It looked exactly as it had the day Muur finished it, small, flat on one side, slightly convex on the other, dark metal with that faint blue-gray quality visible in direct light. Cold, even inside the sealed container, in a sealed chamber on a cold world, colder than it should have been. He picked it up with his bare hand. He carried it outside, into the low gray daylight, and held it in his open palm. For a long moment, nothing happened. The talisman sat in his hand. He turned it over. He examined the flat side, then the convex side. He ran his thumb along the edge. He reached out with the force, carefully, the way he had been trained to probe unfamiliar objects, lightly at distance, without committing his full attention. He felt something move. It was subtle, not a jolt or a surge, a shift. The specific quality of movement that belongs to something very large adjusting its position very slightly. Like a sleeper, deep in sleep, turning over without waking. Like a weight redistributing itself inside a sealed container. The movement was not threatening in its texture. It was almost comfortable, almost familiar. He put the talisman on. The cord was still intact. Muur had made it from material that resisted degradation, and 2 centuries had confirmed that the material worked as intended. The talisman rested against his chest, under his outer layer, against his skin. For 3 days, it was everything the texts had suggested it would be. The power was real. That is the part of this story that requires stating clearly, because it would be easy to read what followed and conclude that the talisman had deceived him from the beginning, that the power was illusory, a lure, a trick. It was not. The power was genuine. For 3 days, the acolyte moved through the force with a capacity that was not his own, augmented by something ancient and dense that flowed through the talisman and into him like water through a broken dam. He felt Muur's alchemical knowledge available to him at the edges of his awareness, not as a voice, not as an instruction, but as a kind of expanded intuition. A sense of how matter could be pressed and shaped and altered that went far beyond his own training. He could also feel the talisman's second function operating at low level around him, the plague effect, reaching outward into the environment, touching the few small living things in the area. He observed this carefully. He kept his distance from anything he did not want changed. He felt, in those 3 days, completely in control. He made camp in one of the stone buildings. He ate from his supplies. He slept lightly with the talisman still against his skin, and when he woke the power was still there, and the presence inside the metal was still the quiet, shifting thing he had first felt in his palm. Present, but not intrusive. Enormous, but patient. On the morning of the 3rd day, he decided to test the transfer resistance more directly. He reached into the talisman with his full attention, not the careful, distant probe of the first moment, but a committed extension of his awareness into the metal. The way you might open a door you have been standing outside for 3 days and finally step through. He felt Muur immediately. Not the sleeper's shift, not the distant wait. Muur, present, focused, specific, and in the moment of the acolyte's full attention, no longer patient. It did not happen all at once. That was the thing he had not understood from the texts. The descriptions he had read made it sound like a sudden event, a takeover, a possession, a door being forced. What actually happened was slower and more precise than that. It was more like a conversation in a language you did not know you were already speaking. The presence settled into the architecture of his thoughts carefully, not forcing, not crashing through. Moving into the spaces between his own thinking the way fog moves into a room, not through the door, but through every gap, every crack, every place the seal was not perfect. He felt his own thoughts still operating. He could still think. He could still form intentions. He could still feel his own personality intact. But there was something else in the room with him now, and it was not leaving. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, he understood that he had made an error. The understanding came in pieces, each piece arriving with the specific quality of something you had known for a long time, finally becoming impossible to ignore. He had believed his training was sufficient defense. His training was, in fact, significant. He was holding. He could feel himself holding. His will pressed against Muur's like two hands on opposite sides of a door, both applying pressure, neither winning yet. But Muur had been doing this for 5,000 years, and the acolyte had been doing it for approximately 16 hours. By evening of the third day, the balance had shifted enough that he could feel the direction things were moving. He could feel his own defenses, still intact, but tiring. He could feel Muur's presence, not tiring at all. Patient in the specific way of something that has no relationship with urgency, because it has no relationship with time. He tried to remove the talisman. His hands would not cooperate in the way he intended. He left the unnamed world in his ship. The records do not show where he went. The navigation logs of his vessel, if they survived at all, have not been recovered. What is known is that he ended up on another nameless world, smaller than the first, with a flat stone landscape and very little vegetation. He had been traveling for approximately 2 weeks. He was found 3 weeks after leaving Muur's world by a pair of Sith scouts operating in the region, who had been following rumors of a young relic hunter moving through abandoned sites. They found his ship first, landed in an open area. Then they found the building he had sheltered in, low, single room. The kind of temporary structure that had been scattered across a dozen worlds in this region during the Sith expansion. He was inside. He was dead. He was 23 years old, and there was nothing about his body that explained clearly why he had died. No wound, no obvious cause. He looked like someone who had simply stopped. The talisman was on the floor beside his hand. The cord had broken or been removed, though the scouts found no evidence of anyone else having been present. The talisman had fallen and struck the stone floor at an angle, and the impact had opened a crack along its upper face. Fine, precise, running from one edge approximately a third of the way across the surface. The first physical mark the talisman had acquired since Muur finished making it. The scouts looked at the talisman on the floor. They looked at the dead young man beside it. Neither of them picked it up with their bare hands. They were Sith scouts, not acolytes, and they had lived long enough to develop the specific wisdom of people who have seen what overconfidence produces. They reported what they had found. They described the talisman. They left it where it was. Someone came eventually. The record does not say who. The record, for this period, is what it has always been. Partial, damaged, full of the gaps left by a galaxy that was burning its own libraries faster than it could write new ones. What is known is that the talisman did not remain on that nameless flat world indefinitely, because it surfaces again in texts 800 years later, held by different hands, in a different era, under different circumstances. What traveled with it, across those 800 years and whatever hands held it in the interim, was the crack. The crack did not heal. Metal of this composition, dark, dense, alchemically treated, did not heal the way living things healed. It did not close over time. It did not diminish. What the acolyte's death had marked into the talisman stayed marked, as permanent as anything the dark side had ever pressed into matter. The young man who had carried it for 3 days had left exactly one thing on the object he thought he was taking for himself. The object had taken everything else from him. The crack remained, and it would remain, across centuries, across every hand that held the talisman from that point forward. A small line on dark metal. The first evidence that something had happened to this object beyond its making. The first proof that time, in one form or another, was accumulating on its surface. It was not the last. Most people, when they understand exactly what is going to happen to them, stop. They find a reason. They reassess. They decide that the mission was not worth the cost, that someone else can carry this particular weight. that the galaxy will manage without them making this specific sacrifice on this specific day. It is not cowardice. It is the reasonable response of a mind that has correctly calculated the odds and arrived at the rational conclusion. Celeste Morn understood exactly what was going to happen to her on Taris. She understood it completely, in detail, with the clarity of someone who had been briefed thoroughly, and who had the intelligence to believe what she had been told. She went anyway, not because she was brave, not because she was reckless, because the alternative was leaving the talisman on a planet of 3 billion people, and she had done the same calculation everyone does in that moment, her life against 3 billion, and the math was not complicated. That is not heroism. That is just arithmetic, the exhausting, quiet, thankless kind. The Jedi Covenant was not officially acknowledged by the Jedi Order. This was intentional. The Covenant operated in the spaces between official policy, a secretive group within the Order, composed of masters and operatives who had become convinced, through their own research and their own interpretation of Force visions, that a catastrophic Sith resurgence was coming. Not might be coming, was coming. The question was only when and in what form, and whether anything could be done in advance to reduce the damage. Their methods were not always methods the broader order would have approved of. They kept their own archives. They ran their own operations. They tracked artifacts, individuals, and potential threats without reporting everything to the Jedi Council. They believed they were protecting the galaxy from something the Council was not yet ready to accept was inevitable. Whether they were right about that is a different question from whether they were effective. And whether they were effective is a different question from whether the cost of their methods was worth paying. Celeste Morn had been a Covenant shadow operative for 6 years by the time she was sent to Taris. She was 31 years old. She was not famous within the Order. The Covenant did not produce famous people by design. She was competent in the specific ways that shadow work required. She could move without being noticed. She could assess situations quickly. She could make decisions alone without the support structure that most Jedi depended on. She had a particular stillness to her that her instructors had noted early in her training. Not coldness, but a quality of settled attention that meant she did not waste energy on reactions that did not serve the situation. She had been briefed on the Muur Talisman extensively before the Taris mission. The Covenant had been tracking the artifact for decades, following the fragmentary trail of its appearances through the historical record, building a picture of what it was and what it did. The briefing she received was the most complete account of the talisman that existed anywhere in the galaxy at that time. She knew its origin. She knew its alchemical function. She knew about the Rakghoul plague effect. She knew about the possession mechanism, the way the compressed fragment of Muur's consciousness would attempt to transfer into any Force-sensitive host who wore it long enough. She knew the timeline. 3 days before the transfer attempt became serious. Less time for hosts with less training. More time for hosts with exceptional resistance, but not indefinitely more. She had a containment procedure. A sealed transport case built to the Covenant's specifications for exactly this type of artifact. Force-suppressive lining, physical locks, designed to be carried without skin contact. She had practiced the retrieval sequence. She had done everything that could be done in preparation. She went to Taris. Taris in 3964 BB was a planet in the process of discovering how fragile its own civilization was. The planet was heavily urbanized, one of the most densely populated worlds in the Outer Rim, with a city that covered the entire landmass in layered tiers, the upper levels gleaming and wealthy, the lower levels progressively darker and more desperate the further down you went. 3 billion people lived there, stacked on top of each other in a structure of interdependence so complete that any serious disruption to any layer would cascade through all of them. The Mandalorian Wars had not yet reached Taris directly, but the planet felt them. Trade routes were disrupted. Refugees were arriving from worlds closer to the front. The Jedi were stretched thin across the Republic, and the Republic's military was stretched thinner. The upper city maintained its surface of order with increasing effort. The lower levels were already operating in the particular lawless space that opens up when authority is too occupied elsewhere to maintain its presence. The Talisman had reached Taris through a chain of acquisitions that the Covenant had been tracking for 18 months. It had passed through several hands in rapid succession, none of them force-sensitive enough to trigger the full possession mechanism. All of them affected in smaller ways they had not understood. The last known holder before Morn's arrival was a black market antiquities dealer in the lower city who had acquired it without knowing its specific properties and had been attempting to sell it to a Mandalorian collector for 3 months. The Mandalorian collector was the problem. The Mandalorians were at war with the Republic. A Mandalorian with a talisman that could produce an army of Rakghouls from any civilian population was not a theoretical danger. It was an active one. Morn arrived on Taris with 2 objectives: locate the talisman before the sale completed, and contain it using the Covenant's established procedure. She had 4 days, based on the Covenant's intelligence about the sale timeline. She had the talisman in her hands within 36 hours. She found it in the lower city, in a storage room attached to the dealer's operation, inside a container that was not the Covenant's sealed case and was not designed for what it was holding. The dealer had it wrapped in ordinary fabric inside a lockbox. She had bypassed his security without incident. She stood in the storage room with a small light source and opened the lockbox and looked at the talisman in its fabric wrapping without touching it. Then she put on her containment gloves and picked it up. She turned it over in her gloved hands, the way she had been trained to examine unfamiliar artifacts, systematically, without committing her attention fully until she had completed the physical assessment. She noted the crack along the upper face. She noted the cold, which the briefing had mentioned, and which was, in person, more pronounced than the description had prepared her for. She noted the weight, which was heavier than the size suggested. Then she reached out with the force, carefully, at the controlled distance the briefing had specified. She felt Muur immediately, not as a theoretical presence, not as a faint impression. He was there, compressed, patient, and in the moment her force awareness touched the metal, suddenly oriented toward her with an attention that was precise and deliberate. She pulled her awareness back. The presence did not follow beyond the metal. The gloves were functioning. The containment properties were holding. But the quality of his attention in that brief moment of contact was not what she had expected. He had recognized her. Not her specifically. He could not have known her name or her history. What he had recognized was her type, the shape of her force signature, the particular quality of a trained Jedi mind that he had been encountering and failing to transfer into, since before this galaxy had a republic. He had felt this kind of mind before. He knew what it felt like to press against it. He knew how long it took. She pulled the talisman toward the sealed transport case and prepared to complete the containment sequence. That was when the lower city began to collapse. It was not the Mandalorians. It was a gang war, the kind of conflict that had been building in the lower levels for months, waiting for the moment when the upper city's security forces were sufficiently distracted. 3 factions had chosen this particular week to resolve a dispute over territory that encompassed several entire city blocks. The violence was immediate and comprehensive. The route Morn had planned for exfiltration became impassable within minutes of the fighting starting, not because of the fighting itself, but because the lower city's architecture responded to large-scale violence by sealing its transit corridors. an automated safety measure that was designed for fire containment and had the side effect of turning evacuation routes into locked passages. She was sealed in the lower city with the talisman. The sealed transport case was in her kit. The containment procedure was still possible. What was no longer possible was the exfiltration timeline. She was now looking at hours, minimum, before she could reach a route that was open. Hours in the lower city of Taris, which was currently in the process of tearing itself apart, with a talisman whose plague effect was already operating at low level, and which, if it came into contact with the wrong person at the wrong moment, would begin producing Rakghouls in a sealed urban environment containing 3 billion people. She had two options. She could leave it, find a place to secure the container, mark the location, extract herself, and return when the corridors reopened. This was the procedurally correct choice. It was also the choice that left the most powerful Sith artifact in the known galaxy sitting in an unsecured storage location in a city that was currently experiencing active gang warfare, on a planet that a Mandalorian collector had been trying to acquire it from for 3 months. Or she could take it onto her person. She stood in the storage room and looked at the sealed container in her hands and thought about this for approximately 45 seconds. 45 seconds was, under the circumstances, a long time. Then she opened the container, picked up the talisman with her gloved hand, and put it on. Muur did not wait. The briefing had said 3 days before the transfer attempt became serious. The briefing had been based on historical accounts of Force sensitives with significant but not exceptional training. Morn was not an exceptional case in the briefing's terms. She was a competent shadow operative, well-trained, disciplined. The briefing had implied she would have the same 3 days. She did not have 3 days. The moment the talisman made contact with her skin, the cord settling against the back of her neck, the metal resting against her chest, Muur arrived in her mind with the directness of someone who had been practicing this exact approach for 5,000 years and had no interest in the preliminary stages. There was no slow fog, no gradual settling. He came in the way an experienced hand enters an argument, without announcement, going directly to the point. She held. It cost her more than she expected. She had trained for this. The Covenant had specific mental disciplines for resisting artifact-based possession attempts, and she had practiced them until they were reflexive. The disciplines worked. She could feel them working, the specific quality of her own mind pressing back against Muur's advance, maintaining the boundary between her thoughts and his presence. She was holding, but holding took everything she had. And she was in the middle of a collapsing lower city with no exit route, and 3 billion people above and below her, who had no idea what was resting against her chest. She moved. She had to keep moving. Standing still gave the lower city's violence too many opportunities to bring new complications. She worked through the sealed corridors looking for an alternative route, for a transit option the automated systems had not locked, for anything that gave her a path upward and out. She found something else instead. The Draper Oubliette was in a Sith collector's sealed room 4 levels below where she had found the talisman. She had not known it was there. The Covenant's intelligence on Taris had not included it. She found it by accident, a sealed door that her Force awareness flagged as containing something significant, opened with a bypass that took her 11 minutes to complete, leading to a room that held 3 objects on stone shelves, 2 of which were minor Sith relics, and 1 of which was a sealed coffin of ancient design that she recognized from the Covenant's artifact registry within seconds of seeing it. The Draper Oubliette, a Sith artifact designed in the same era as the talisman, built by a different maker for a different purpose, but alchemically treated in ways that made it relevant to her situation. Its primary function was containment. It was built to hold a Force-sensitive person in suspended animation indefinitely, with the stasis preserving both the physical body and the force signature of whoever was inside it. It had been designed as a prison. It could also function as a vault. She stood in front of it with Muur pressing against the walls of her mind and understood, in the specific way that people understand things they have already decided before they finish thinking them through, what she was going to do. She was going to get inside. The logic was clean, if the conclusion was not. Her living force presence was the only thing suppressing the talisman's possession mechanism effectively enough to prevent a transfer. If she died, the suppression ended, and the talisman would be free in a city of 3 billion people with no one holding it back. If she was incapacitated, unconscious, wounded badly enough, the same outcome followed. She could not guarantee her own survival in the lower city over the hours or days it might take for the corridors to reopen. Even if she survived the immediate situation, she was already feeling the cost of the suppression, and she had been wearing the talisman for less than 2 hours. The oubliette would put her in stasis. In stasis, her force presence would continue to operate, suppressing the talisman passively, without requiring conscious effort, without degrading. It would hold indefinitely. The talisman could not transfer into her while she was in stasis, because there was no active consciousness for it to push against. And the oubliette itself was built to survive things that ordinary structures did not survive. Someone would find it eventually. Someone who knew what they were doing. That was not guaranteed, but it was more likely than her surviving the lower city while holding Muur back with one hand and navigating gang warfare with the other. She checked the oubliette's mechanism. It was functional. She spent 8 minutes confirming this, running through every check she could perform quickly. It was old, older than the Republic as she knew it, but Sith alchemy held. The stasis function was intact. She climbed inside. The interior was narrow. She lay flat, on her back, with the talisman against her chest and Muur still pressing against the walls of her mind with the patient, practiced pressure she had been feeling since the moment she put it on. She reached up and found the interior seal mechanism. She ran through the activation sequence. She had one moment, brief, functional, without sentimentality, in which she understood that she did not know when this would end. She understood it might be decades. She understood, with the part of her mind that was very good at calculating odds, that it might be considerably longer than decades. She sealed the oubliette from the inside. The stasis initiated. The last thing she was aware of was Muur's presence, still pushing, still patient, still there, and then the stasis took her awareness down. And down into a quiet that had no duration. The lower city of Taris continued its collapse above and around the oubliette. The gang war burned through 3 levels before the upper city's security forces restored order 4 days later. The Mandalorian collector never received his purchase. The antiquities dealer was killed in the fighting. The Covenant received no report from Celeste Morn, and after 6 months, listed her as missing in the field, a classification that covered a range of outcomes, most of them permanent. The oubliette sat in its sealed room. The talisman sat inside the oubliette. Celeste Morn sat inside her own stillness, holding. Outside, the Mandalorian wars continued. The Republic bled. Revan and Malak went to war and came back changed. The things the Covenant had been afraid of began, slowly and then quickly, to happen. None of it reached the sealed room. None of it reached the oubliette. None of it reached the woman inside, or the metal against her chest, or the ancient compressed presence that had been waiting for the right host since before this city existed. The talisman was cold, as it always was. The crack along its upper face was unchanged. It had acquired nothing new on Taris, no new mark, no new trace. What it had acquired was a keeper. Whether that was better or worse than what came before was not a question the talisman could answer. It had no opinion. It had nothing but the long, patient dark. Darth Malak killed 300 million people to eliminate one. He did not find her. Bastila Shan survived the bombardment of Taris. She escaped in the confusion, in the hours before the first strike reached the lower levels. And by the time Malak's fleet finished its work, she was already gone. The 300 million people who were not Bastila Shan did not escape. They were in their homes, in their workplaces, in the corridors and transit systems, and lower-level markets of a city that had existed for thousands of years and would cease to exist in 6 days. 300 million people. To find one. He did not find her. The oubliette did not register any of this. It could not. It had no mechanism for registering anything. It sat 40 meters below the surface of a city that was about to stop being a city. And it held what it held. And it waited the way it had been waiting since Celeste Morn sealed it from the inside 8 years earlier. And the bombardment came down. And the oubliette continued to wait. This is the chapter about what stillness looks like when everything around it is burning. The Jedi Civil War had not been what anyone expected. Revan and Malak had gone to fight the Mandalorians at the head of a Jedi-led fleet against the explicit wishes of the Jedi Council. They had won. The Mandalorian Wars ended at Malachor V. Ended in the particular way that things end when one side does something the other side did not believe anyone would actually do. Then, Revan and Malak had disappeared into the unknown regions, with a significant portion of the fleet that had followed them. When they came back different. They came back as Sith Lords, at the head of a Sith empire that had been waiting in the dark for exactly the kind of leadership they now provided. The Republic had not recovered from the Mandalorian Wars before the Jedi Civil War began. The sequence was deliberate. Revan's strategy, later examined by historians who had access to his tactical records, showed a clear understanding that the Republic's capacity to resist a second sustained conflict immediately after the first was effectively zero. He had been right. The Republic was losing. Revan had been captured through a complicated sequence of events involving the Jedi Council and a young Jedi named Bastila Shan, whose rare ability to project battle meditation had made her one of the most valuable assets either side possessed, and had been reprogrammed by the Council, his memories replaced, his identity reconstructed as a weapon against his former empire. Malak had not been captured. Malak had taken command of the Sith fleet and continued the war with a directness that Revan's strategy had never quite had. Revan had been subtle. Malak was not subtle. Malak found Bastila Shan's escape pod above Taris and made the decision that defined his legacy in a single order to his fleet commanders: destroy the planet. On Taris, 8 years after Celeste Morn sealed herself inside the oubliette, the city was not the same city. The gang war that had been burning through the lower levels when she went into stasis had resolved, messily, incompletely, in the way that conflicts over territory in sealed urban environments tend to resolve, which is to say not fully but exhaustedly. The upper city had reasserted control. New factions had emerged. The Mandalorian Wars had drawn away a significant portion of the planet's young population. Volunteers, conscripts, people leaving because there was nothing holding them, and the war seemed like a reason to move. The refugee population from worlds closer to the front had continued to grow. The lower levels had become more crowded and less stable than they had been. The collector whose sealed room held the oubliette had died 2 years after Morn went into stasis, killed in the gang war, indirectly, through a chain of consequences that began with a debt and ended with a corridor that had been sealed when it should have been open. His collection had been partially looted and partially absorbed by whoever took over his operation. The sealed room had not been opened. The people who took over his operation did not know the room existed, because the collector had not told anyone about it, because the collector had understood correctly that some things were safer unknown. The room remained sealed. The oubliette remained inside it. Celeste Morn remained inside the oubliette. The talisman remained against her chest, cold and still and patient. Above all of this, on the surface levels of Taris, ordinary life continued in the way ordinary life continues during wars, with effort, with diminishment, with the particular determination of people who have decided that existing is itself a form of resistance to the forces that would prefer they did not. Then the fleet arrived. The Sith fleet came out of hyperspace above Taris without warning. This was standard. Warning served no tactical purpose and several strategic disadvantages. The people on the surface of Taris had no warning. They had whatever time the interval between the fleet's arrival and the first strike provided, which was not enough time to do anything useful with. The first strikes hit the upper city. The upper city of Taris was built to be impressive. Wide boulevards, tall structures, the architecture of a civilization that had spent centuries accumulating wealth and expressing it in stone and durasteel. It took the first wave of turbolaser fire with the specific indifference of things that are too large to immediately understand what is happening to them. Sections collapsed. Fires started. The power grid failed across 17 districts in the first 4 minutes. The emergency response systems activated, and then, within 6 minutes of activation, ceased to function because the infrastructure they depended on had been destroyed. The second wave hit the middle levels. The third wave began working down through the lower levels in sequence, which was not tactically necessary. The upper city's destruction would have produced sufficient structural collapse to kill most of the population without continued bombardment, but which reflected Malak's specific intention. He was not trying to damage Taris. He was trying to remove it. The difference between those two things, at the scale of an orbital bombardment, was the difference between stopping when the city stopped functioning and continuing until there was nothing left that could be described as a city. He continued. The sealed room that held the oubliette was in the lower city, approximately 12 levels below the surface of the upper city, in a section of the older construction that had been built before the upper city's current architecture existed. When the upper city's structural supports began to fail under the bombardment, the collapse moved downward in waves, not evenly, not predictably, but in the specific catastrophic sequence of a structure that was never designed to absorb the removal of its upper sections. Several levels above the sealed room came down in sequence over the course of approximately 40 minutes. The weight of their collapse pressed into the levels below, which pressed into the levels below those, which pressed into the oldest construction at the bottom, which was built from materials dense enough and techniques old enough that they did not collapse the way the newer levels did. They compressed. They shifted. They moved downward rather than inward. The sealed room did not collapse. The door, already sealed, held under the pressure of the levels above it settling onto its frame. The stone walls, cut from the same dense native material that Taris's earliest builders had used before the city became a city built on top of a city held. The oubliette, inside the room, shifted approximately 3 centimeters to the left as the floor beneath it moved. It did not tip. It did not crack. The seals held. The stasis continued. Above the sealed room, 40 meters of compressed rubble settled into place, the accumulated remains of 12 levels of urban civilization, pressed flat by the weight of everything above it. The room became a pocket inside the debris field, a small, sealed space in the middle of what had been the lower city of Taris and was now a mass of broken construction that extended to the horizon in every direction. Celeste Morn did not wake. The stasis registered no interruption. Her force signature continued its steady, passive suppression of the talisman's possession mechanism, unaffected by the destruction above her, unaffected by the weight of 40 meters of rubble pressing down toward the room she lay in, unaffected by the 6 days of fire that burned across the surface of what had been Taris. The talisman was cold, as it always was. The crack along its upper face was unchanged. The fires burned for 6 days. This is a fact that requires sitting with, because 6 days is a long time for a planet to burn. The fires were fed by the city itself, by the fuel systems and power conduits, and stored materials of a civilization that had spent thousands of years accumulating the kind of density that burns thoroughly when ignited at scale. The fires moved through levels that the bombardment had not directly struck, finding fuel in the collapse, finding oxygen through the gaps the collapse had opened, burning in the dark below the surface where the original strikes had not reached. On the 6th day, the fires ran out of what they needed to continue and began to go out, not all at once, in sections, from the edges inward, as the fuel was exhausted and the oxygen pathways closed. By the end of the 7th day, Taris was not burning. It was not anything. It was a surface of compressed rubble, still warm in places, under a sky that was dark with the particulate matter of 300 million lives and the civilization they had built. The Sith fleet left. Bastila Shan was not on Taris. She had not been on Taris when the bombardment began. Malak's intelligence had been correct that she had gone down to the surface, and incorrect about when she had come back up. The entire operation had been built on a timing error of approximately 4 hours. 300 million people. 4 hours. Below the rubble, in the sealed pocket, in the oubliette, nothing had changed. This is the part of the story that requires the most careful attention, because it is the part that says something specific about what the talisman was. 300 million people had just died within a few kilometers of the object in every direction. The force, which registers death, which responds to the ending of life with the specific disturbance that Jedi and Sith both feel as a physical sensation, had just experienced one of the largest single disruptions in its recorded history. Jedi on the other side of the galaxy felt Taris. They described it afterward in terms of a wave, a collapse, a sudden silence where something had been. The talisman felt none of this. Not because it was shielded from the Force, it was deeply embedded in it, but because the talisman's relationship with the Force was not the kind that received impressions from the outside. It was the kind that projected outward, that reached for specific things, Force-sensitive hosts, living minds with the right architecture, and ignored everything else. 300 million non-Force-sensitive deaths were not something the talisman was designed to notice. The compressed fragment of Muur inside it had no mechanism for registering the scale of what had just happened above it. The talisman waited. It had been waiting for 8 years. It would wait for 31 more, in the dark below the rubble of a dead city, with the fires cooling above it and the galaxy's history moving forward without it. The years passed the way years pass in sealed spaces, without any texture that could be described from the inside, because there was no inside. The oubliette had no windows. The stasis had no dreams. The talisman had no experience of duration. What accumulated was not time as any living thing would recognize it, but purely the fact of time, the passage of years registered only by the decay of certain materials. The slow drift of temperature toward equilibrium, the patient, incremental work of entropy on everything except the things that had been built to resist it. Taris above the sealed room changed slowly. The rubble settled over the first decade. The surface cooled completely. Rain came. Taris's atmosphere was still functional. The bombardment had not been large enough to produce the kind of atmospheric catastrophe that some worlds had suffered under orbital attack, and the weather systems that had always operated above the city continued to operate above its ruins. Rain fell on the rubble. Small things grew in the gaps. The ruins became, by increments, the kind of landscape that is described as devastated in the immediate aftermath and archaeological after enough generations have passed. The first salvage crews arrived within 5 years of the bombardment. They were not looking for the oubliette. They were looking for anything recoverable, materials, technology, anything that the ruins contained that could be useful in a galaxy that was still at war and had limited patience for sentiment about dead cities. They worked the upper levels, which were the most accessible. They found what they found and left. The lower levels were not accessible. The compression of the collapse had sealed them more thoroughly than any deliberate construction could have managed. Getting below the first 30 meters of rubble required equipment that the early salvage crews did not have and could not justify acquiring for a ruined planet that had already given up most of what was worth taking. The oubliette stayed where it was. In 3925 Bibi, 31 years after the bombardment, a small Republic survey team arrived on Taris as part of a broader assessment of Outer Rim worlds that had been damaged during the Jedi Civil War. Their mandate was to evaluate the feasibility of resettlement, to determine whether the planet's environment had recovered sufficiently to support a permanent population, and what infrastructure would be required to begin the process. They spent 3 weeks on the surface. They took atmospheric readings, soil samples, structural assessments of the upper rubble layers. They produced a report that recommended against immediate resettlement, but noted that the planet's environmental recovery was progressing within expected parameters. One member of the survey team, a geologist named Prin Vaseth, whose job was assessing the structural integrity of the rubble layers at various depths, noted in her personal log that her scanning equipment had registered an unusual reading at approximately 40 meters below the surface in one specific grid section. The reading was anomalous, a pocket of preserved atmosphere, which suggested an intact sealed space of some kind. She flagged it in her log and intended to include it in her formal report. She did not include it in her formal report. The mission timeline was compressed in the final week, and she had 23 other anomalous readings to process, and the sealed pocket was not in a grid section that the resettlement assessment considered priority. She noted it, filed her log, and moved on. Her log was archived with the rest of the survey mission records. The archive was stored in a Republic facility on Coruscant, which changed hands twice in the subsequent centuries and was partially damaged in a records purge during the Ruzan Reformation. Her log was not among the records that survived. The oubliette stayed where it was, 40 meters down, in the dark, in the sealed pocket of a dead city, with the talisman inside it, and Celeste Morn inside with the talisman, holding against something that did not know time had passed, pressing back against something that had been pressing since before this city was built. The rubble above it was quiet. The ruins of Taris were quiet. The galaxy above was not quiet. It was never quiet, but none of its noise reached down through 40 meters of compressed stone and durasteel to where the oubliette waited. It would wait longer still. There is no word in any language spoken in the galaxy today for what the talisman experienced during those years. This is not a poetic observation. It is a precise one. Every language that exists was built by living things, things that experience duration, that feel the difference between a long time and a short time, that have a relationship with waiting. The talisman had none of these things. It did not wait. It did not endure. It did not persist through the centuries in the way that a patient person persists through a long afternoon. It simply continued to exist, without any internal experience of that continuation, the way a stone continues to exist at the bottom of a river, not waiting for anything, not aware of the water moving above it, not counting the years. 3,945 years. That number means something to a human mind. It produces a specific feeling, a kind of vertigo, a reaching for scale that the mind cannot quite complete. It is longer than every recorded human civilization that has ever existed. It is longer than the gap between the founding of the Republic and its end. It is long enough that languages die and are replaced, and the replacement languages also begin to age. It is long enough that the stars themselves move measurably from their positions. To the talisman, it was nothing, less than nothing. It was the absence of anything that could be called experience, extending in both directions from the sealed dark of the oubliette, and it was identical in every moment to every other moment, and it did not accumulate into anything the talisman could be said to have survived. The galaxy, however, did not have the same relationship with those years. The galaxy experienced every one of them. The Sith triumvirate came first. While the oubliette sat in its sealed pocket below Taris, the war that had destroyed Taris continued and then transformed. Darth Revan reprogrammed, memory replaced, fighting now for the Republic he had once tried to destroy, defeated Malak. The Sith Empire fractured. In the fracturing, three figures emerged who divided the remnants of Revan's empire between them and pursued its continuation with methods that were different from Revan's and from Malak's and from each other's. Darth Traya, Darth Nihilus, Darth Sion. Nihilus was the one who would have interested the talisman. If the talisman had interests, he consumed the Force, devoured it, drew entire planets of life into himself in a process that left nothing behind. He was, in some ways, the most extreme expression of what the dark side could produce in a single individual. He destroyed Qatar. He consumed the Jedi Conclave there. Nearly every Jedi Master who had survived the Jedi Civil War, assembled in one place, gone in a single event. The Jedi Order came close during this period to complete extinction. It did not go extinct. Jedi exile, the woman history would eventually name Mitra Surik, dismantled the triumvirate piece by piece, with a small group of companions and a specific relationship with the Force that the triumvirate had not accounted for. The Sith triumvirate ended. The Republic survived, diminished. The Jedi Order survived, smaller. Below Taris, the oubliette sat in its pocket. The fires of the Jedi Civil War's aftermath cooled in the Force the way physical fires cool, slowly, and with residual warmth that persisted for decades after the last active flame. The galaxy was quiet for a generation after the triumvirate's end. A specific, exhausted quiet. The quiet of a civilization that had been at war for so long that peace felt like a different kind of shock. A century passed. The Republic rebuilt. Not to what it had been before Revan. That version of the Republic was gone. But to something functional. Trade routes were restored. Planets that had been caught in the crossfire of the Jedi Civil War were assessed. Some resettled, some abandoned as not worth the resource investment. Taris was among the abandoned. The ruins were too extensive, the population gone, the infrastructure non-existent. The Republic had too many other priorities to invest in a world that would take generations to make habitable. The Jedi Order rebuilt more slowly than the Republic. The losses at Qatar had taken something from the Order that could not be quickly replaced. Not bodies, though the bodies were irreplaceable too, but institutional memory. The Masters who died at Qatar had carried knowledge that existed nowhere else. In no archive, in no text, knowledge of specific Force traditions, specific approaches, specific understandings of the dark side that had been accumulated across centuries and passed from master to student and were now simply gone. The students who survived the triumvirate era trained the next generation with gaps in what they knew, and those students trained the next generation with the same gaps. And by the time 3 generations had passed, the gaps were no longer felt as gaps. They were simply the shape of what was known. The name Karness Muur was among the things that became difficult to find in the Order's records during this period. Not deliberately erased, simply deprioritized, incompletely preserved. The references scattered across archives that were themselves incomplete. Scholars who looked for him could find traces. Most scholars had other things to look for. Another century passed. Then another. The old Sith Wars ended not in a single decisive moment, but in the gradual exhaustion of the forces that had sustained them. The Sith factions that had survived the Triumvirate's fall fought among themselves with the particular intensity of groups that have lost a common enemy and turned their methods inward. They diminished by increments, each conflict reducing the number of significant Sith figures, each reduction making the next conflict more final. The Jedi did not destroy the Sith during this period so much as contain them while the Sith completed the process of destroying each other. By approximately 2000 BB, the galaxy had entered a period that historians would later call the New Sith Wars, a resurgence that proved the Sith were not gone, only reduced. The war that followed was long and grinding and produced casualties that rivaled the Jedi Civil War in scale, if not in the specific dramatic intensity of that conflict. Worlds changed hands. The Republic fractured geographically, with different regions under different kinds of control at different times. The Jedi fought on multiple fronts simultaneously and lost, by the end of it, a significant portion of their number again. Then, Ruusan, the Thought Bomb, the Brotherhood of Darkness, and nearly every Jedi present at the final Battle of Ruusan, gone in a single moment of dark side energy that destroyed Sith and Jedi alike without discrimination. Darth Bane surviving alone. The rule of two established in the immediate aftermath. Two Sith, always two, master and apprentice. The entire tradition compressed into a succession that could not be destroyed by a single decisive strike, because it was never large enough to present a single decisive target. The Ruusan Reformation followed. The Republic reorganized itself, disarmed its standing military, restructured its governance. The Jedi were repositioned as peacekeepers rather than soldiers. 1,000 years of relative peace began. Not perfect peace, not the absence of conflict, but the absence of the kind of galaxy-scale war that had defined the previous 3,000 years. Below Taris, below 40 meters of rubble, the oubliette did not register any of this. 1,000 years is a long time for peace. The Republic that emerged from the Ruusan Reformation was not the Republic that had existed before the New Sith Wars. It was, in many ways, not the same institution at all, same name, same basic structure, but populated by people whose relationship with the idea of the Republic had been shaped by 1,000 years of relative stability rather than by the memory of the wars. The Jedi Order that operated during this period was the order that would eventually produce Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker. An order that had been shaped by the long peace into something more contemplative, more rule-bound, more cautious than the Order of Celeste Morn's era. The knowledge of the Muur Talisman existed in the Jedi archives during this period as a fragmentary entry in a section on Sith artifacts of the Old Republic era. It was not classified. It was not flagged as a priority concern. It was what most very old things become in institutional memory, a historical curiosity, noted, filed, not thought about unless someone went specifically looking. No one went specifically looking. The Jedi Covenant that had sent Celeste Morn to Taris had not survived the events that followed her disappearance. It had been exposed, condemned, dismantled. Its archives had been partially absorbed into the main Jedi archive and partially destroyed. The records it had accumulated about the talisman, the most complete records that had existed anywhere, were among the materials that did not survive the transition cleanly. What remained was the fragment. What remained was enough to know the talisman had existed, not enough to know where it was. More centuries passed. Coruscant was rebuilt 3 times in different ways during the Long Peace, not from destruction, but from the accumulation of growth. New levels were added. Old levels were reclassified. The city-planet that had been the Republic's capital for thousands of years continued its slow process of burying its own history under the weight of its present. Archives that had been easily accessible became deep storage. Records that had been deep storage became effectively lost. The galaxy's memory of its own past became, by increments, selective. The Clone Wars began and ended in 3 years. From the perspective of the Talisman's timeline, from the perspective of a thing that had been sealed below a dead city for nearly 4,000 years, the Clone Wars were a brief, bright, violent flare that lasted no time at all. Millions died. The Republic transformed into the Empire in a single Senate session. The Jedi were purged in a single night. Things that had taken thousands of years to build were ended in a matter of hours. The talisman was not present for any of it. It was below Taris, which was not a significant location during the Clone Wars. Taris was rubble. The Empire had no immediate interest in rubble. That changed in 22 BB. The Imperial surveys of Outer Rim worlds began as a practical exercise in resource assessment. The empire that Palpatine had built required resources on a scale the Republic had never needed. The Death Star alone consumed materials that would have supplied entire star systems for generations. And the Death Star was one project among hundreds. The Outer Rim was surveyed systematically, world by world, looking for raw materials, strategic locations, salvageable infrastructure, and anything else that the Empire's various departments could classify as useful. Taris was surveyed in 22 BB by a team from the Imperial Reclamation Service, a division responsible for the recovery of artifacts and materials from archaeological and historical sites across the Empire. Their mandate on Taris was broad: assess the ruins for recoverable materials, catalog any artifacts of historical significance encountered during excavation, and report anything unusual for further analysis. They had better equipment than Prinvaseth's survey team from 3,000 years earlier. Their scanning technology could reach 60 meters below the surface with reasonable precision. They found the pocket on their 3rd day of surveying the lower city grid. They found it because of the Force signature. 3,000 years of Celeste Morn's stasis had not diminished her presence in the Force. The stasis had preserved it exactly as it was on the day she sealed the oubliette. What their scanners detected was not an empty sealed space, but a sealed space that registered a faint but persistent Force anomaly, something alive, or something that had the signature of life. 40 meters below the surface in a sealed pocket of old construction. They dug. It took 4 days with the equipment they had. The rubble above the pocket was compressed enough that standard excavation protocols required modification twice before they reached the sealed room's outer structure. When they finally broke through, they found the room intact, the stone walls, the original door still in its frame, the 3 shelves with the 2 minor relics and the oubliette. The team leader, a woman named Ossadrel, who had spent 20 years in reclamation, and had developed the specific incuriosity of someone who had found too many things to be surprised by any of them, looked at the oubliette for a long time. She noted the unusual metal. She noted the Force signature, stronger now that they were in the same room with it. She noted that the signature seemed to come from inside the sealed coffin. She did not open it. 20 years in reclamation had also given her a specific wisdom about sealed Sith artifacts, which was that the correct response to a sealed Sith artifact that was giving off a Force signature was to seal it again, better, inside a container you controlled, and send it somewhere with the personnel and equipment to assess it properly. She placed the oubliette in a containment crate. She labeled it clearly. She logged it in the mission record as anomalous artifact, Taris Dig Site 7, pending analysis. Force signature present. Do not open without specialist authorization. She sent it to the Imperial storage facility that had been established on the surface of Taris during the survey operation, a temporary structure, prefabricated, designed to hold recovered materials until they could be transported off-world. The analysis was listed as pending. It would remain pending for 3 years. The storage facility was not a significant location. It was a locked building on a dead world, holding materials that various Imperial departments had flagged as interesting, without yet finding the time to examine. It had a small staff, maintenance personnel, a security detail, a single archivist who processed incoming items and managed the outgoing transfer schedule. The oubliette sat in its containment crate in the 3rd row of the facility's main storage area. It was cold, which the archivist noted when he processed it and filed the temperature as a material property. The force signature it registered on his scanner was faint enough that he did not feel it himself. He had no force sensitivity, and specific enough that he flagged it correctly for specialist review without fully understanding what he was flagging. The specialist review was requested. The request entered a queue. The queue was long. Inside the containment crate, inside the oubliette, Celeste Morn's stasis continued without interruption. The talisman was cold, as it always was. The crack along its upper face was unchanged. The compressed presence of Karness Muur was exactly what it had been in 3964 Bibi, patient, dense, oriented toward force-sensitive hosts, undiminished by 4,000 years of waiting in the dark. 4,000 years. The number meant nothing to the talisman. It meant nothing to Muur, compressed inside it. It meant nothing to Celeste Morn, in her stasis, holding without knowing she was holding. Somewhere above the storage facility, on a planet the Empire was in the process of remaking in its own image, the galaxy continued. New things were built. Old things were ended. History accumulated, the way history always accumulates, in layers, pressing down on everything below it, not knowing what it was burying. The talisman waited in its crate in a prefabricated building on a dead world. The specialist review would come. Just not yet. Most of the people who held the talisman across its 5,000 years of existence were force-sensitive. They were Sith Lords, Jedi operatives, dark side acolytes. People whose relationship with power made them the kind of person who reached for dangerous things. The talisman's history, told from that angle, looks like a record of the exceptional, the powerful, the significant. But Torvin Sess was none of those things. He was a man who processed artifacts for a living. He had a desk. He had a filing system he had refined over 11 years into something he was quietly proud of. He had a lunch routine and a transit route home, and a specific preference for which chair he sat in during the documentation division's monthly briefings. He had no force sensitivity, no heroic destiny, no connection to the long dark history of the object that arrived on his desk on a Tuesday morning in 19 BB inside a containment crate labeled Taris Dig Site 7. He had 4 minutes with it. Those 4 minutes are worth more attention than most of the famous people in this story received. Not because of what happened during them, because of what did not. The Imperial Artifact Documentation Division occupied 3 floors of a government building in Coruscant's administrative district. Not the most prestigious location on the most powerful planet in the galaxy, but a functional one. The division processed approximately 400 items per standard month, drawn from archaeological surveys, battlefield recoveries, estate seizures, and the ongoing cataloging of materials that the Empire had inherited from the Republic and had not yet gotten around to assessing. The work was methodical and largely unexciting. Most items turned out to be exactly what they appeared to be. Some turned out to be interesting. Very few turned out to be significant. Torvin Sess had been processing artifacts for 11 years and had personally catalogued approximately 4,300 items in that time. He had found 4 things in that span that were subsequently classified as significant: a piece of ancient Mandalorian armor, 2 Jedi training holocrons recovered from a destroyed temple, and a navigational device of pre-Republic design that the technical division had spent 8 months trying to understand before giving up. These 4 discoveries had not made him famous. Discovery was not the point of his job. Processing was the point, and processing meant receiving items, examining them according to protocol, recording what could be recorded without specialist equipment, flagging what required further analysis, and moving the item through the system correctly. He was very good at this. His error rate over 11 years was less than 0.5%, which was the best in his division. His filing system was occasionally consulted as a model by new personnel. His supervisor had noted in 3 consecutive performance reviews that Sess was exactly the kind of person a documentation division needed: careful, consistent, unimpressed by things that did not require being impressed by. On the Tuesday morning the Taris crate arrived, he had 17 other items to process before it. The crate itself arrived by internal transport from the receiving dock, placed on his desk by a logistics officer who did not say anything beyond the standard delivery acknowledgement. Sess noted its arrival in his incoming log, assigned it a processing number, and set it aside while he finished the item he was currently working on: a collection of pre-Clone Wars communications equipment recovered from a storage facility on Eriadu. Unremarkable. Processing time, approximately 20 minutes. He reached the Taris crate at mid-morning. The outer casing was standard Imperial Reclamation containment, gray metal, sealed with a documentation tag that included the original field log from the Taris survey team and the transfer records showing its path from Taris to the central processing facility on Coruscant. He read the field log first, as protocol required. He noted the Force signature flag, the specialist authorization requirement on the inner item, and the temperature anomaly notation from the Taris archivist. He flagged these in his own log immediately. Force-sensitive items required a separate processing track, which meant his role was limited to external documentation and physical measurement. He would not be opening the inner container. His job did not extend that far. He opened the outer casing. The oubliette was inside, resting in a foam support that the Taris archivist had fitted around it during transport. It looked, to Torvin Sess, like a sealed coffin of unusual design, which was exactly what it was. He noted the dimensions with his measuring instruments. He noted the material composition using his standard analysis tool, which returned the result unknown alloy, pre-Republic designation, further analysis required. An output his tool produced for approximately 1 in every 200 items he processed. He noted the general condition as excellent, which surprised him mildly given the logged recovery circumstances. He noted the absence of visible markings or inscriptions on the outer surface. Then, he picked it up. He needed to weigh it. Weighing required lifting. He placed both hands under the oubliette and lifted it from the foam support to position it on his scale. It was heavier than it looked. He noted this. It was also colder than the ambient temperature of the room, which was climate-controlled to a consistent standard. He noted this too, recording it as a material property consistent with the Taris archivist's earlier observation, flagging it for the specialist's attention, along with everything else. He held it for the time it took to position it on the scale, step back, read the measurement, and record the number. Then he held it for the additional time it took to shift it back to the foam support, which required some repositioning because the shape was not symmetrical, and the support had a specific orientation. 4 minutes, approximately. He was not thinking about what was inside it. He was thinking about the weight measurement, which was going to require the specialist to assess whether the density was consistent with the logged material composition, and about whether the temperature anomaly warranted a separate specialist flag or could be included in the existing force sensitivity flag, and about whether the foam support had been correctly oriented in the first place, or whether the original Terrace archivist had placed the oubliette in it upside down, which would have been an easy mistake given the lack of visible external markings. He was thinking, in other words, about documentation. Inside the oubliette, the talisman was 3 centimeters from Torvin Sess's left hand, 3 centimeters of sealed ancient metal, 3 centimeters of Sith alchemy and stasis function, and 4,000 years of waiting. The talisman's plague effect, operating always at low level, reaching outward into the environment through whatever gaps existed in the containment, reached through the oubliette's outer casing and through the containment crate's material and into the air of the processing room. It found nothing to work with. The plague effect required living targets. Torvin Sess was a living target. But the plague effect's secondary function, the one that mattered, the possession mechanism, required force sensitivity. It required a specific architecture of mind that the dark side could enter and work with. Sess had no such architecture. His mind was entirely ordinary in the Force's terms, present, alive, invisible to the talisman's reaching, in the same way that a stone is invisible to something that is only looking for water. The talisman did not register him. Muur's compressed presence inside the metal, patient, dense, oriented toward force-sensitive hosts, did not stir, did not shift, did not produce the sleeper's adjustment that the acolyte had felt 2,000 years earlier. There was nothing to respond to. Torvin Sess was, from the talisman's perspective, not present. He lifted the oubliette. He weighed it. He put it back down. He recorded his measurements. He wrote his flag notation. Force signature confirmed. Temperature anomaly noted. Specialist review required. Do not open without authorization. In clean, precise language that accurately described everything he had observed. Then he moved it to the force-sensitive items queue on the left side of his desk, picked up the next item in his incoming tray, and continued his morning. He was a careful man. This bears repeating, because careful men are easy to overlook and difficult to replace. His lunch that day was a standard canteen meal. He ate in the division's break room, which had a window looking out onto a mid-level Coruscant transit hub, and he read a briefing document about the ongoing Outer Rim sieges while he ate. The war was going well, according to the briefing document. The Separatist leadership was fragmenting. General Grievous had been killed on Utapau 3 weeks earlier. The end of the conflict seemed close. He finished lunch, returned to his desk, processed 11 more items before the end of his shift, and left the building at the standard close of work. His transit route home took 40 minutes on 2 different lines. He had dinner at home. He lived alone, had lived alone for 6 years since the end of a relationship he did not think about in professional settings, and read the evening edition of the Imperial Holonet News, which reported the same information as the morning briefing document in slightly different language. He went to sleep at a reasonable hour. He was 38 years old. He would be 38 years old for 3 more weeks before his birthday. He had a sister on Corellia he communicated with monthly. He had 2 colleagues in the division he considered friends, in the specific limited way that professional relationships sometimes produce. He had the filing system he was proud of, and the transit route he preferred, and the chair he always chose in the briefing room. None of this connected to the oubliette on his desk. None of his ordinary life had any relationship with what sat 3 meters from where he was currently sleeping, in the force-sensitive items queue, waiting for a specialist who was qualified to assess it. He was not that specialist. He had never been that specialist. He was the person who made sure the item reached the specialist correctly, and he had done that correctly. And tomorrow he would process 17 more items from the incoming tray and flag 2 of them, and file all of them in the system that he had built over 11 years into something he was quietly proud of. The specialist review queue for force-sensitive items contained, on the morning after Torvin Sess processed the Taris crate, 47 items awaiting assessment. The analysts qualified to conduct these assessments were attached to a separate division, the Force Artifact Analysis Unit, which had been staffed primarily by Jedi consultants operating under the Republic's pre-war arrangement with the Order, and which had, since the beginning of the Clone Wars, been transitioning toward a civilian staff under Imperial direction. The transition had not been smooth. Jedi consultants had reduced their cooperation with Imperial artifact assessment as the war continued, and as the relationship between the Order and Palpatine's office had become more complicated. The civilian analysts who were supposed to replace them were still being trained. The queue had been growing. On the morning 3 weeks after Torvin Sess processed the Taris crate, the queue changed in a different way. Order 66 was executed. The Jedi consultants who had still been cooperating with the Artifact Analysis Unit, 3 of them working on items in the queue, were dead within 48 hours. 2 died on Coruscant during the Temple assault. 1 died on a mission assignment in the Outer Rim, killed by clone troopers who had been working alongside her for 8 months. The civilian analysts who were in training were reassigned in the immediate chaos of the Jedi Purge's aftermath, their training suspended, their unit placed under a different command structure, while the Empire reorganized its approach to Force-related matters. The Force-sensitive items queue was frozen pending reorganization. The Taris crate sat in the queue. Torvin Sess processed his incoming items and did not think about the crate specifically. It had left his desk. It had been filed correctly. It was in the right queue, which meant it was no longer his concern. His job was processing. The queue was someone else's concern. The reorganization took 3 years. During those 3 years, Torvin Sess continued his work. He processed approximately 1,400 items. His error rate remained below 0.5%. His filing system absorbed the new Imperial classification protocols without significant disruption. He had built it to be adaptable, which was one of the things he was quietly proud of. He did not think about the Taris crate. There was no reason to think about it. He processed 400 items a month and could not be expected to maintain specific memory of any individual item beyond its filing details, which were in the system and accessible to anyone who needed them. The crate was in the queue. The queue would be processed when the reorganization was complete. The system was functioning as designed. He went home each evening by his preferred transit route. He had dinner. He read the news, which changed in quality and character as the Empire consolidated. Less information, more tone. The specific texture of a media environment that had decided certainty was more important than accuracy. He went to sleep. He was alive. He was ordinary. He was exactly the kind of person that the galaxy's largest events always moved through without stopping. Not a target, not a resource, not a symbol. A man with a desk and a filing system, and a transit route, and a sister on Corellia. 14 years after processing the Taris crate, he died in an accident on a Coruscant transit platform. A mechanical failure in a transit car door. A fall. A sequence of events that lasted approximately 4 seconds and that had no relationship to anything in this story, except his presence in it. He was 52 years old. The filing system he had built outlasted him by 6 years before a division reorganization replaced it with a standardized Imperial template. The Taris crate entry survived the transition, transferred automatically to the new system, sitting in its Q category with its flags intact and its specialist review still listed as pending. Torvin Sess had done his job correctly. The item was exactly where it was supposed to be. Whatever happened next was not his department. It never had been. The Empire was 4 days old when Darth Vader walked into the artifact assessment room alone. 4 days. The Republic had existed for 25,000 years, and it had been gone for 4 days. And the man who had helped end it was still learning how to breathe inside the machine that was keeping him alive. The suit was new. The mechanics of it were still unfamiliar in the specific way that a prosthetic limb is unfamiliar, functional, responsive, but requiring a conscious attention that a natural body never demanded. Every breath was assisted. Every movement was registered. The suit processed his biology with a consistency that left no room for the small physical variations that a living body produces naturally. The slight irregularity of an unassisted heartbeat. The unconscious shift of breathing when something unexpected happened. He had not yet learned to stop noticing the suit's consistency. He would, eventually. That morning, he still noticed it. He had a list of items to assess. The Emperor had given it to him personally. Not as an assignment exactly, more as an expectation. Palpatine had spent decades accumulating knowledge of Force-related artifacts across the Republic, and the purge of Jedi influence from Imperial systems had surfaced hundreds of items that required review by someone with both the Force sensitivity and the clearance to assess them properly. Vader was, at 4 days into his new existence, the only person who qualified on both counts. He worked through the list methodically. Most items were minor, training tools, ceremonial objects, things the Jedi had used in ways that posed no threat to the Empire and held no value to the Sith. He assessed them quickly, noted his findings, moved on. He had 31 items on the list that morning. The Taris crate was number 19. The assessment room was on a secure floor of the Imperial Artifact Documentation Division's building, a room set aside specifically for Force-sensitive item review, different from the standard processing areas. It had reinforced walls, a single entry point, and a recording system that was disabled as a matter of protocol whenever a Sith evaluation was in progress. This protocol had been Palpatine's specific instruction. He had no interest in documentation of Force techniques used in private assessments. What happened in these rooms was not recorded. It existed only in the memory of whoever was present. Vader's attendants waited outside. The room had a single table, a single overhead light source, and the item to be assessed, which had been placed on the table before his arrival by a logistics officer who had then left immediately. The containment crate was already open when he entered. The oubliette was visible inside it, resting in its foam support, exactly as Torvin Sess had left it 3 years earlier. Vader stood in the doorway for a moment before entering. This was not hesitation. It was assessment, the same approach he applied to any unfamiliar situation, reading the room before committing to a position inside it. The oubliette registered on his Force awareness from the doorway. It was not subtle. Whatever was inside it was old and dense and specific in a way that most artifacts were not. Most artifacts held impressions, echoes of the people who had used them, emotional residue, the fading warmth of past Force interaction. This was different. This was not residue. This was presence. Something inside the sealed metal was not a memory. It was still there. He entered the room. He approached the table. He looked at the oubliette for a long moment, without touching it. The oubliette's outer surface was smooth except for the slight variations in the metal's texture that came from its age and composition. There were no markings, no inscriptions, nothing on the outside that explained what it was or what it held. Vader noted the cold. It was visible as a faint distortion in the air above the metal's surface. The ambient warmth of the room meeting the object's consistent chill and bending slightly away from it. He reached out with the Force first. Not physically, not yet. What he encountered was layered. The outermost layer was the stasis function, ancient, alchemically sustained, still operating after what his Force reading suggested was an extraordinary period of time. longer than the item's recovery date suggested it should have been operating. Much longer. Inside the stasis, he could feel a living presence, suppressed, suspended, not conscious, but not absent. A force signature that was Jedi in its basic architecture, trained and disciplined, pressed into a kind of stillness that was different from death. Not dead, waiting. He pressed his awareness further, past the living signature toward what was underneath it. He found Muur. It happened in the way that two people in a dark room find each other. Not through sight, not through sound, but through the specific awareness of another presence occupying the same space. Vader's force awareness touched the compressed fragment inside the talisman, and the fragment responded. Not with fear. This is the part that required attention, because fear was the standard response. Every dark side presence Vader had encountered in 4 days of artifact assessment had registered his presence with something that translated through the Force as recognition of a threat, a recoiling, a compression. The specific energetic quality of something that understood it was in the presence of a more powerful force and adjusted accordingly. That was the normal response. The presence inside the talisman did not recoil. It oriented. The distinction was precise and significant. It did not back away from his awareness. It turned toward it, with the slow, deliberate movement of something that had been waiting in a specific direction for a very long time, and had just registered that the direction had finally produced something worth facing. It was not aggressive. It was not threatening. It was attentive in the way that something becomes attentive when, after an indeterminate period of waiting, the thing it has been waiting for arrives. Vader removed his force awareness carefully. The presence did not follow. It was contained within the metal, and whatever was suppressing it from inside was still functioning. But in the moment of contact, something had been established between them that was not a communication exactly, and not a recognition exactly, but something that combined elements of both. He took off his glove. He placed his bare hand on the surface of the oubliette. Through the metal, through the stasis seals, through the sleeping Jedi presence, through 4,000 years of compressed waiting, he felt the talisman directly. Not through force extension, through contact. The cold of the metal transferred into his palm immediately. His body temperature did not warm the surface. The surface remained exactly as cold as it had been before his hand touched it, as though it had no interest in the warmth he was offering. The presence inside oriented further. It pressed, not outward, not toward him, but in his direction. The difference was important. It was not attempting to reach him through the metal. It was pointing toward him the way a compass needle points toward a magnetic field, not moving, not acting, but aligned. Completely, specifically aligned toward the shape of his force presence, with an attention that felt, through the metal, like recognition. Anakin Skywalker had been dead for 4 days. Darth Vader had existed for 4 days. Whatever was inside the talisman did not know either of these names. It did not know about Anakin Skywalker, or the Jedi Order, or Palpatine, or the Empire, or Order 66. It had been sealed inside dark metal since before the Republic existed in any form he would have recognized. It knew none of the context that defined every other interaction Vader had had in his 4 days of existence. What it knew was his force signature, the specific architecture of a mind that was, in the talisman's terms, exactly what it had been built to find. Powerful, trained to a level that made the training feel like structure rather than effort, carrying a darkness that was new but built on a foundation that was very old and very deep. The talisman had encountered force-sensitive hosts before, had pressed against them, found their resistances, waited them out, or failed to break them. It had never encountered anything quite like this. Vader stood with his hand on the oubliette and felt the talisman feel him. 4 minutes. He did not move for 4 minutes. His suit breathed for him with its mechanical consistency, registering nothing unusual. His hand remained flat against the cold surface. The presence inside remained oriented toward him, not pushing, not invading, just aligned, waiting, in the way it had always waited, but waiting now toward something specific. Then he lifted his hand. He put his glove back on. He stepped back from the table. He looked at the oubliette for another moment. From a distance now, without contact, his force awareness pulled fully back inside himself. He did not open it. This decision was not recorded. It was not discussed. There was no one in the room to discuss it with, and the recording equipment was disabled, and the reasoning that produced the decision existed only inside the mind of the man who made it. What can be observed from the outside is what he did next, which was to walk to the door, call in his logistics officer, and give 2 specific instructions. First, the item was to be removed from the force-sensitive analysis queue and placed in deep storage, Tier 7, the classification level that required his personal authorization for any subsequent access. Second, the item was not to appear in any summary report sent to the Emperor's office. The logistics officer noted both instructions without comment. That was his job. He was, in the way of logistics officers across the galaxy, a person whose professional value consisted entirely of implementing instructions without asking questions about them. The facility logs recorded what they recorded. Item reclassified. Storage Tier 7. Authorization. Lord Vader. That was all. Why Vader made this decision is not knowable from the available record. Several explanations are possible. He may have assessed the talisman as too dangerous to use and too dangerous to destroy, and chosen the containment option as the least problematic. He may have understood, through his force reading, that the living Jedi presence inside the oubliette made the item a more complicated situation than a simple relic assessment. That opening it would release something he was not prepared to deal with that morning. With 31 items on his list and an empire 4 days old, he may have felt, through the contact, something that he did not want Palpatine to know about. Something in the talisman's response to his presence that he preferred to process privately, or that he preferred to leave unprocessed indefinitely. He may simply have decided that some things were better left sealed. He went through the remaining 12 items on his list. He assessed them, noted his findings, completed his work for the day. He left the building in the late afternoon. The logistics officer completed his transfer paperwork. The oubliette was moved to deep storage Tier 7 before the end of the shift. The facility logs were consistent and clean, and told almost nothing about what had actually happened in the assessment room. Deep storage Tier 7 was not a place that was visited often. It was a climate-controlled section of the facility's lowest level, a long corridor of sealed containers, each classified above standard access, each requiring specific authorization to open or even to examine. Items ended up in Tier 7 for various reasons. Some were there because they were genuinely dangerous. Some were there because they were valuable enough to require exceptional security. Some were there because the person who had classified them at that level had reasons they had not recorded, and without the recorded reasoning, no one else had the authority to reclassify them downward. The oubliette joined a collection of approximately 200 items that occupied Tier 7 at the time of its arrival. It was logged, containerized, placed in its position in the corridor, and sealed behind the access panel that required Vader's authorization code. Celeste Morn did not wake. The talisman was cold as it always was. The crack along its upper face was unchanged. Muur's compressed presence, which had spent 4 minutes oriented toward the most powerful force sensitive it had encountered in 5,000 years, settled back into its patient alignment. The object that had made contact was gone. The contact had ended. The waiting continued. Outside the facility, the Empire consolidated. Systems were reorganized. The Jedi who had survived Order 66 were hunted by Vader himself, systematically, patiently, one by one. The galaxy that had existed 2 weeks before the assessment room encounter was becoming, day by day, the galaxy that Palpatine had been building toward for 30 years. 16 years passed. In 3BB, during a routine inventory audit of the facility's deep storage sections, a junior administrator generated an access request for Tier 7 to complete the audit's documentation. The request required Vader's authorization code to proceed. The request was submitted through standard channels and sat in a queue for 11 days before an automated system flagged it for review by Vader's office. Vader's office responded with a single line: Tier 7 inventory audit suspended. Do not resubmit. The junior administrator noted this in his audit log and moved on to Tier 6. The Galactic Civil War began. The facility changed administration twice. Once when its oversight was transferred from one Imperial department to another during a bureaucratic reorganization in 1BB, and once when the Battle of Endor in 4AB created the kind of institutional chaos in which administrative records move faster than the people responsible for them. In the months following Endor, certain items in deep storage across multiple Imperial facilities were moved, relocated, lost, stolen, or transferred by people who were acting quickly in a collapsing system, and who did not always have full knowledge of what they were moving. The Tier 7 access logs show a single entry from 4AB. Items 7089 through 7094 transferred to Transport Manifest XT7744. Destination unspecified. The oubliette was item 7091. Transport Manifest XT7714 was a ship heading toward the Outer Rim. The ship's destination was listed as unspecified because the person who filed the manifest had been working quickly in a situation that did not encourage careful documentation. The ship left Coruscant in the 3rd month after Endor. The oubliette's trail went briefly dark. It reappeared 18 months later in a different record, on a different world, in different hands. She had been 31 years old when she sealed the oubliette from the inside. She was still 31 years old when it opened. The body does not age in stasis. This is one of the few things about the process that functions exactly as described in the technical documentation. The cells do not divide. The metabolism does not proceed. The biological clock that measures a human life in the gradual accumulation of cellular damage and repair stops completely, and when the stasis ends, it resumes from exactly the point it stopped, as though no time has passed. Her body had experienced no time passing. Her mind was a different matter. The waking happened in stages, and the stages were not clean. The first stage was awareness, a return of consciousness that had no context attached to it yet, just the raw fact of being present. She was aware of being in her body. She was aware of the oubliette's interior, the narrow metal walls, the slight pressure of the stasis field dissolving, the return of sensation to her hands and face. She was aware that something was wrong with the waking, that it was happening too quickly, without the controlled sequence the oubliette's mechanism was designed to produce. Someone had opened it incorrectly. The second stage was pain. Not injury. The stasis had preserved her perfectly. But the nervous system, resuming function after an interruption of any duration, produces pain as part of its restart sequence. This was familiar. She had studied it in her training. Knowing it was coming did not make it easier when it arrived. The third stage was the wait. It arrived between one breath and the next, a sudden, complete understanding of where she was in time. Not the year specifically, not the names and events, Just the duration. The stasis had not given her dreams, but it had given her something on waking, a sense of the gap, imprecise but enormous, the way a person who has slept through the night knows without looking at a clock that significant time has passed. She knew it had been a very long time before she knew anything specific about how long. And with the weight of the duration came Muur. He had not faded. She had understood, intellectually, that he would not fade. The talisman's design had no mechanism for diminishment, no process by which the compressed fragment would degrade over time. She had known this, but knowledge and experience are not the same thing. And experiencing Muur after 4,000 years of suppression was different from knowing he would still be there. He was sharper. This was the thing she had not anticipated. The compression that had occurred over 4,000 years had done something to the fragment, had focused it, the way a liquid reduces when it is heated, becoming more concentrated as its volume decreases. The Muur she felt pressing against her mind in the first seconds of waking was not the sleeper's patient shift she had felt in 3,964 Bibi. It was immediate and precise, like a blade rather than a weight, finding the seams in her awareness with a specificity that suggested 4,000 years of having nothing to do except understand the architecture of Jedi defenses from the inside. She held. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, and she had done very hard things. Her defenses were intact. The stasis had preserved them exactly as she had maintained them at sealing. But intact was not the same as ready. A wall that has not been used is still a wall, but the person who stands behind it has not been standing there. She had to find her position again, find the specific quality of will that she had developed over the months between putting the talisman on and climbing into the oubliette. And she had to find it while also processing the pain of waking and the confusion of incorrect stasis termination and the distant sound of someone in the room with her who had opened the coffin and was now, presumably, watching her return to consciousness. She held. She found her position. The wall went up. Muur pressed. She pressed back. The equilibrium that had existed before the stasis re-established itself over the course of approximately 4 minutes, ragged and effortful in a way it had not been at sealing, but functional. She opened her eyes. The man standing over the open oubliette was approximately 50 years old, human, with the specific appearance of someone who had spent significant time in the outer rim, weathered, careful, carrying his age in the way of people who have not lived easily. He took a step back when she opened her eyes. His hand went to something at his belt, not a weapon, or not primarily a weapon, a scanner. He was reading her. His name, she learned later, was Hosk Tralis. He had force sensitivity, low-level, untrained, the kind that manifests as intuition and occasional perception, rather than as any specific ability. He had been tracking the oubliette for 3 years, using a combination of Imperial records fragments and older texts he had acquired through channels he was not forthcoming about. He knew, approximately, what the oubliette was. He knew significantly less about what was inside it. He had opened it because he had understood that it contained a person. He had not understood the correct opening sequence, because the correct opening sequence was not in any text he had found. What the incorrect sequence produced was a stasis interruption rather than a stasis termination. The difference between cutting a power line and switching off the power, both of which stop the current, but produce very different conditions in the equipment that was running on it. She did not explain this to him immediately. She was focused on holding. She sat up slowly. She assessed her body, functional, no damage from the stasis, pain resolving as her nervous system completed its restart. She assessed the room, a structure she did not recognize, not the oubliette's original location. small and poorly lit, on a world she could not immediately identify. She assessed trailless, curious, cautious, not hostile. She assessed the talisman against her chest, present, cold, Muur active and pressing with that new sharpened focus that she was still adjusting to. She said, in a voice that had not been used for 4,000 years and sounded exactly as it had before, "What year is it?" Not a question, a requirement. The year was 19 AB. She held that number for a long time after Trailis told her. She did not react to it visibly, because the part of her that processed information had separated at some point during the 4 minutes of equilibrium finding from the part of her that would have produced a visible reaction. The processing part received the number and began working with it. The rest of her remained still. 31 years old, 19 AB. She had gone into the oubliette in 3964 BB. The mathematics were simple. The result was not simple. The result was a number so large that holding it fully inside a single moment of consciousness was not possible. She could hold the number. She could hold what the number represented in abstract: the passage of time, the death of everyone she had known, the transformation of the galaxy into something she had no frame for yet. She could not hold all of this simultaneously with any emotional component attached to it. The emotional component would have to come later, if it came at all. She spent 3 weeks on the world, a small, sparsely populated outer rim planet that Trailis had been using as a base of operations. Unremarkable in every way that unremarkable places are unremarkable. Learning what year it was in the fullest sense. Not just the number, the history, what had happened between 3964 BB and 19 AB. Trailis had a library of sorts, datapads, records, the accumulated reading of a person who spent a lot of time in isolated locations and had filled that time with information. She worked through it systematically. The Old Republic's end, the Clone Wars, the Empire, the Rebellion, Endor, the New Republic. She read for 12 hours a day for 3 weeks, and at the end of 3 weeks, she had a functional understanding of the broad outline of 4,000 years of galactic history. She did not cry. She had assessed that she did not have the vocabulary for what she felt, and this assessment was accurate. The people she had known, her colleagues in the Covenant, the Jedi she had trained alongside, the individuals whose faces she could recall with complete clarity, had been dead for longer than most civilizations last. She had no framework for grieving at that scale. The framework had not been built in her, because no one builds a framework for something they do not expect to survive. She held Muur back. She read. She ate the food Trailis provided. She slept in short intervals, waking each time with Muur immediately present, pressing, and each time rebuilding her position in the space of a few seconds, rather than the 4 minutes it had taken on the first waking. She was getting faster. On the 16th day, she developed the technique. It had been in the theoretical background of her understanding since before the stasis, a possibility she had considered and not fully developed, because the situation in 3964 BB had not given her the time to develop it. The technique allowed her to remove the talisman from her person without triggering an immediate transfer attempt. It required a specific quality of force suppression applied at the moment of removal, a compression of the talisman's outward reach, held in place for approximately 30 seconds, during which the cord was lifted over her head and the talisman was placed into a containment vessel before the suppression was released. The containment vessel was a secondary sealed case from her equipment, which had survived the stasis in the same condition as everything else she had carried. It was not as sophisticated as the Covenant's containment cases had been, but it functioned. The force suppressive lining was still active. The physical seals still held. She practiced the removal technique 4 times before trusting it. On the 5th attempt, she removed the talisman and placed it in the case and sealed it. Muur's presence inside the case was immediately more distant, present in her force awareness, but filtered, reduced to the level of the background pressure she had been managing since waking rather than the direct, sharp focus she felt through skin contact. She held the case in her hands for a moment, then she put it in her pack. On the 21st day, she thanked Tralus with the specific brevity of someone who does not have a comfortable vocabulary for gratitude and knows it. He had questions, many questions, accumulated over 3 weeks of providing food and information to a woman who had not explained herself, and who he had clearly understood, through his low-level force sensitivity, was carrying something in her pack that he did not want to be too close to. She answered his questions with the minimum information that accuracy required. She told him what the talisman was. She told him what it did. She told him not to look for it, not to follow her, and not to tell anyone what he had found in the oubliette. She did not tell him why. She did not have to. He looked at her with the expression of a person who has understood, fully and finally, that the thing they spent 3 years tracking was not an adventure. He nodded. He did not ask any more questions. She left. The world's single settlement had a transit connection that ran twice weekly to a regional hub. She took the next available departure, sat in the back of a transport with 12 other passengers who did not look at her, and watched the planet fall away below the viewport. The pack was on the seat beside her. The case was inside the pack. The talisman was inside the case. Muur was present in the background of her awareness, as he would be for every moment of every day for the rest of whatever her life now was. Patient, sharpened, waiting for an error she did not intend to make. She looked at the stars through the viewport. They were the same stars. That was the thing about stars. At the scale she was now operating on, even 4,000 years was not enough to make them unrecognizable. The same stars, in very nearly the same positions over a completely different galaxy. She had nowhere specific to go. She had no organization, no mission, no handler, no covenant. She had a sealed case in her pack, and a technique for keeping it sealed, and a capacity for holding that had been tested against 4,000 years of pressure and had not broken. She began, in the practical way of people who do not have the luxury of extended contemplation, to think about what came next. There was a great deal of galaxy to move through. There was a great deal of history still being made. And somewhere in all of that, there was the question of what happened to the talisman when she finally ran out of the ability to carry it, which she understood, now that she was awake and moving, was not a hypothetical question, but a scheduled one. Muur understood this too. He had nothing but time, and now, for the first time in 4,000 years, so did she. 118 years is a long time to carry something you hate. Not dislike, not distrust. Hate, the specific, sustained, daily hate of a person who has lived with something long enough to understand it completely and has found, in that complete understanding, nothing worth preserving. Celeste Muur knew the talisman better than anyone alive. She knew its weight, its cold, the specific quality of Muur's pressure at different times of day, and in different states of her own exhaustion. She knew how it responded to proximity with other force sensitives, the slight intensification of its outward reach, the way Muur's attention sharpened inside the case when someone worth noticing came within range. She had carried it through the Yuzan Vong War, through the Dark Nest Crisis, through the Swarm War, through the rise and fall of Jacen Solo, through the emergence of the one Sith under Darth Krayt. 118 years. She had become, across those years, something that did not have a name in any Jedi tradition she had trained in. Not a knight, not a master, not a shadow operative in a covenant that no longer existed. Something older than those categories and outside them, a single person, carrying a single object, making a single decision every day of her life to keep that object away from everyone who wanted it and everyone it wanted. The decision had never been complicated. It had only ever been exhausting. Taris in 137 AB was a world in the process of becoming something again. It had been rubble for nearly 4,000 years. The ruins of the city Malak had bombarded, still visible beneath the growth that had reclaimed the surface, the old durasteel and stone showing through wherever the vegetation was thin. There had been resettlement attempts across the centuries, most of them partial, most of them eventually abandoned. The most recent effort had produced something that could be described as a city in the way that a foundation can be described as a building. The structure was there, the intention was there, but the scale was a small fraction of what had existed before the bombardment. The people who lived on the new Taris were people who had decided, for various reasons, that a world with a complicated history was preferable to the alternatives available to them. They were practical people, by and large. They did not spend much time thinking about what was underneath the ground they walked on. Celeste Morn had come to Taris for a reason she had not fully articulated even to herself. The closest she could get to an articulation was this: she had been carrying the talisman for 118 years, and she was tired in a way that sleep did not address, and the world where she had first put it on felt like the correct place to figure out what came next. It was not logic. It was the specific gravity of certain places, the way some locations pull at certain people for reasons that have nothing to do with rationality. She had been on Taris for 11 days when she encountered Cade Skywalker. She knew what he was before she knew who he was. The talisman told her. She was in the lower settlement, the rebuilt district that occupied approximately 1/10 of the surface area that the original lower city had covered. When the case in her pack registered the shift, she felt it through the suppressive lining, through the secondary seals, through all the layers of containment she had maintained for over a century. Muur's attention, which had been running at its standard background level of patient, sharpened focus, changed. It was the compass needle movement. She had felt it before, twice in 118 years, when she had come within range of force sensitives powerful enough to trigger Muur's active orientation. Both previous times it had been individuals whose power was significant but not extraordinary. Both times the orientation had been notable but not urgent. This was different. The shift was immediate and complete, from background pressure to full alert in the space of a single step. Muur did not ease into it. He arrived at it the way he had arrived at things since she first woke from the stasis, sharply, without preamble, finding the direction with a precision that 4,000 years of compression had honed into something that had no uncertainty in it at all. She stopped walking. She put her hand on her pack. She turned in the direction the orientation was pointing. Across the settlement's main thoroughfare, leaning against a wall with the specific posture of someone who was trying to look like he was not watching for anything, was a young man who looked approximately 25 years old, and who had, even from this distance, even through 118 years of her calibrated force awareness, the most distinctive force signature she had encountered since waking from the stasis. It was the lineage she recognized, not the individual. She had no way of knowing who he was from a force signature alone. But lineage carried a specific quality in the force, a structural resonance that persisted across generations, modifying but not erasing, the way a voice carries family resemblance even when the words are different. She knew this lineage. She had spent 4,000 years of accumulated history learning to read the galaxy's force signatures And this one was not ambiguous. Skywalker. She did not approach him immediately. She found a position where she could observe without being observed, a skill that had not degraded across 118 years of use, and she spent 40 minutes watching Cade Skywalker exist in the settlement's thoroughfare. She assessed him the way she had assessed every significant situation she had encountered since waking, systematically, without committing her position until she had completed the assessment. He was young. He was force-sensitive at a level that explained everything Muur was doing inside the case. He was carrying something in his posture that she recognized from her own mirror. A person who had been through things that left a specific kind of residue. Not trauma exactly, but the permanent alteration that comes from surviving events that were not supposed to be survivable. He was not currently acting like someone who knew what was in her pack. He was acting like someone who was waiting to meet a contact and was mildly irritated by the wait. She knew, watching him, what was going to happen. Not because she had planned it, not because she had decided it before she came to Taris, or before she encountered him, or at any moment she could point to as the moment of decision. She knew because Muur was telling her, with the absolute directness of his compass needle orientation, that the variable she had been managing for 118 years had just changed in a way that made her current management strategy insufficient. She had been the suppressing force. She had been the wall. She had been the thing that stood between the talisman and everyone else. And she had been that thing by maintaining her own force presence as the active element that kept Muur's compressed attention focused on her rather than reaching outward. It worked because she was always present, always the nearest force-sensitive, always the most immediate option. Cade Skywalker was now the most immediate option. She could feel it in the way Muur's attention had redistributed, not away from her entirely, but weighted toward him with a gravitational pull that was going to make her current strategy into a competition she was not certain she could win indefinitely. Not today, not tomorrow. But Muur did not operate on today or tomorrow. He operated on the same timescale as always, patient, accumulated, waiting for the error that extended contact always eventually produced. She had been 31 years old when she first put the talisman on. She was biologically 149 years old now, though her body remained in the condition of the 31-year-old who had gone into the oubliette. 118 years of carrying Muur's daily pressure had not aged her physically. It had done other things, things that were harder to measure but not harder to feel. She was tired, not in the way that sleep addresses, in the way that duration addresses, and only sometimes. She approached him on the second day. She did not explain herself immediately. She sat across from him in the settlement's single-functional cantina, ordered something she did not intend to drink, and watched him process her presence with the particular wariness of a young man who had learned, through experience, to be suspicious of people who sat down across from him uninvited. She told him her name. She told him what she was carrying. She told him, in the compressed, accurate language she had developed over a century of explaining things that required explanation, what the talisman was, and what it had been doing for 5,000 years. She did not tell him what to do with this information. She had not decided yet what she was going to do with it herself. He listened. He was better at listening than his posture suggested he would be. He asked 3 questions, the right 3, in the right order, and his responses to her answers told her more about him than the answers themselves did. He was not reckless. He was not simple. He had a relationship with the dark side that was more complicated than the Jedi tradition she had been trained in would have found comfortable, and he knew it, and he was not embarrassed by it. Muur's orientation throughout the conversation was absolute. She could feel it through the case, through the pack, across the table between them. The compass needle had found its north. It had no interest in pointing anywhere else. She looked at Cade Skywalker across the table and she felt, for the first time in 118 years, that she was not the most important variable in the equation. The transfer decision took 2 more days. Not because she was uncertain about the logic. The logic was clean. Muur's orientation toward Cade was now the dominant factor in the talisman's behavior, which meant that keeping it in her possession was no longer the straightforward suppression exercise it had been for a century. It was a competition between her suppression and Muur's active pull toward a better option, and competitions require energy that simple suppression did not. She could feel the difference in how much it was costing her to hold the standard equilibrium now that Cade was within range. The cost had increased. The cost would continue to increase as long as they were in proximity, and if she left, which she had done before, when she had inadvertently come within range of strong force sensitives and removed herself to restore the equilibrium, she would simply be managing the problem rather than resolving it. The problem did not have a clean resolution. It had a least bad option. The least bad option was Cade. She understood his lineage. She understood, from 118 years of watching the galaxy produce and consume force sensitives, that the Skywalker line carried something structural in the Force that had no equivalent anywhere else. She did not know if that structural quality made Cade more or less resistant to Muur's possession mechanism. She knew that it made him the most significant Force-sensitive currently available. And she knew that Muur had been orienting toward significant Force-sensitives with the specific intention of using their significance as a vehicle. She also knew that Cade Skywalker had survived things that should have broken him, and had not been broken, and was still, despite everything his posture and manner suggested about his relationship with conventional Jedi virtue, making choices that were not the choices of someone who had given up. She gave it to him on the 3rd day, not because she trusted him, because she had run the calculation every way she could run it, and this was still the answer at the end. She had practiced the transfer technique 60 times in 118 years. It was not the removal technique. She had used that thousands of times. The transfer was different. The removal technique put the talisman into the containment case while she was still the active suppressing presence. The transfer required a handoff, a moment in which her suppression was maintained while the talisman moved from her containment to someone else's contact, and then released in a controlled way that gave the new holder the maximum possible time to establish their own position before Muur's full attention arrived. She had practiced it against the idea of a recipient, had run through the sequence in her mind with a theoretical person on the other end. The theoretical person had always been a placeholder, standing across from Cade Skywalker in a room in the lower settlement of rebuilt Taris. She understood that the placeholder had always been going to be a Skywalker. Not because she had known this, because the talisman had known it, and the talisman had been waiting for it since the day Celeste Morn first put it on, in this city, 4,000 years ago. She opened the case. She took the talisman out with her hand, not the containment gloves, not the indirect technique. Her hand, maintaining the suppression through direct contact, holding Muur back with the specific focused will she had been developing since 3964 BB. She held it out to Cade. He looked at it. He looked at her. He understood, from everything she had told him, exactly what he was reaching for. He reached for it anyway. The moment his fingers closed around the metal, she felt the transfer of Muur's orientation with a completeness that was almost physical. A sudden redistribution of pressure, away from her and toward him, with the totality of something that has been waiting for exactly this configuration for a very long time. She maintained her suppression for the 30 seconds the technique required, holding the transition stable, giving Cade the window she had promised him. Then she released. Muur arrived in Cade Skywalker's awareness with everything he had been accumulating since 5,000 Bibi, the full weight of a Sith Lord who had spent 5,000 years in compressed patience, who had sharpened across 4,000 years of stasis into something more focused than the man who had made the talisman, who had been waiting for a Skywalker since before Skywalkers existed as a category the galaxy had a name for. Cade held. He held differently from how she had held, not with the trained Jedi discipline she had spent 30 years developing before Taris, but with something rawer and less structured and, she thought, possibly more suited to the specific opponent. Where her defenses were walls, his were something more like refusal, simple, direct, personal refusal, not a technique, a choice. She watched his face as Muur pressed, and he pressed back, and she thought, with the specific detachment of someone who had just handed off the most important thing she had ever carried, he might actually hold. She left Taris the following morning. She did not say goodbye to Cade. The situation did not call for goodbyes. The situation called for her removing herself from the equation, her force presence, which had been the talisman's primary focus for 118 years, needed to cease being a variable so that Muur's full attention remained on Cade, and Cade had the clearest possible sense of what he was managing. She walked to the settlement's transit point in the early morning, when the light on Taris had the particular quality of a world that had been destroyed and was slowly, imperfectly coming back. The ruins of the old city were visible at the settlement's edges, the shapes of structures that had been tall once, pressed down by 4,000 years of collapse and growth into something that was no longer recognizable as what it had been. She had been in this city when she first put the talisman on. She had been in this city when she gave it away. She did not think about what this meant. She had learned, across 118 years of carrying something she hated, that meaning was less useful than function, and that the functional question now was not what Taris meant, but where she went next, and what she did when she got there. The transport arrived. She got on it. The planet fell away below her for the second time in her life. The pack on the seat beside her was lighter than it had been yesterday. She did not feel relieved. She had expected to feel relieved. What she felt instead was the specific disorientation of a person who has organized their existence around a single sustained task for so long that the task's ending does not produce completion, but absence. The shape of something that had been there every moment of every day for 118 years, no longer there, leaving behind the exact outline of itself in the space where it used to be. Muur was gone from her awareness. For the first time since 3,964 BB, she could not feel him. She sat with that absence for a long time, watching the stars, on a transport heading away from a world that had now held the talisman twice in its history, and released it twice and would not hold it again. Behind her, on Taris, Cade Skywalker was holding. For now, the talisman was small. This is the first thing. Before everything else, before the history, before the names, before the 5,000 years of hands and wars and sealed chambers and waiting, the first thing is the physical fact. It was small enough to sit in a closed palm without the fingers fully closing. It was flat on one side and slightly convex on the other. It was made of dark metal from a dead star system, cut and shaped by a man who had been planning its creation for 11 years and who had understood, with the precision that defined everything he did, that the most important thing he ever made needed to look like nothing. It looked like nothing. That had not changed. What had changed? What the 5,000 years had accumulated on its surface, slowly, in layers that were only visible to someone who knew what they were looking at, was everything else. Cade Skywalker held the talisman for 6 days. In those 6 days, more happened to the talisman than in most of its centuries-long periods of stillness. Not because the events were larger. The bombardment of Taris had been larger by any measurable standard, but because the events of those 6 days were the events the talisman had been built for. Everything before had been waiting. Those 6 days were the purpose. Muur pressed from the first moment of contact with the totality of 5,000 years of accumulated patience converted, all at once, into active pressure. He had never had a host like this. The acolyte whose name history did not record had been talented, but young and undertrained. Celeste Morn had been disciplined and relentless, but had always been managing from a defensive position, holding, not engaging. Cade Skywalker was different from both, in ways that Muur had not fully anticipated. He was a Skywalker. The structural quality that Celeste Morn had sensed in his Force signature, the lineage resonance, the specific deep architecture of a bloodline that the Force had been doing something particular with for several generations, was not something Muur had encountered before. His experience of Force-sensitive hosts covered 5,000 years, but those years had included almost 4,000 in stasis, and the Skywalker line had not existed during his active period. He had oriented toward Cade because the signature was powerful. He had not been prepared for what powerful meant in this particular case. Cade's resistance was not technical. He had Jedi training, partial and interrupted, but his resistance to Muur did not draw on that training in the way Morn's had drawn on hers, where Morn had built walls, careful, maintained. Constructed with the specific craft of someone who had spent 30 years learning Force discipline before she ever encountered the talisman. Cade had something that was harder to describe and harder to break. A refusal that was not a technique, a boundary that was not a defense in any formal sense, but that held with a solidity that Muur kept pressing against and kept finding unchanged. On the first day, Muur made significant progress. Cade was new to the talisman's pressure, new to the specific quality of Muur's possession mechanism, and the learning curve was steep and painful. He felt Muur in his thoughts, not as a voice, exactly, but as a presence that was inserting itself into the spaces between his own thinking, filling gaps, making suggestions that arrived with his own voice, and had to be identified and rejected one by one. On the second day, Cade stopped rejecting them one by one and started rejecting the source. This was the shift Muur had not anticipated. The technique of identifying and refusing individual intrusions assumed that the intrusions were the threat. Cade understood, on the second day, that the intrusions were not the threat. The presence behind them was the threat, and the presence could be addressed directly rather than through its expressions. He could not expel Muur. The talisman's possession mechanism did not work that way, did not have an exit procedure that the host could initiate unilaterally. But he could refuse to engage with the presence as a presence rather than as a series of individual moments. He could, in short, ignore Muur. Not completely. Not in the way you ignore something that is not there. In the way you ignore something that is very much there and very much trying to get your attention, and to which you have decided, as a fundamental matter of position, that you will not be giving your attention regardless of what it does. Muur had spent 5,000 years making himself difficult to ignore. He had never encountered someone who ignored him anyway and meant it. On the fourth day, Cade made a decision that the available records describe incompletely. The records that survive from this period, fragmentary accounts from individuals who were present for parts of what happened, reconstructed later by historians working from incomplete sources, agree on the broad outline but differ on specifics. What is agreed is that Cade Skywalker, on the fourth day of wearing the talisman, attempted something that had not been attempted before in the talisman's recorded history. Not suppression, not resistance, Not the defensive holding that Celeste Morn had sustained for over a century, but an active engagement with Muur's compressed consciousness inside the metal. Not possession in reverse. Not an attempt to control the presence rather than be controlled by it. Something more like a direct conversation with something that had not been spoken to directly since Karness Muur made it and sealed himself inside it in 5000 BB. What passed between Cade Skywalker and the compressed fragment of Karness Muur during this engagement is not fully recorded. The surviving accounts describe Cade as still for an extended period, hours, by some accounts, and then active again, and different in some quality that the observers noted but could not precisely define. He was not possessed. He was not Muur. He was Cade Skywalker, as he had been before, but carrying something in his expression that had not been there before. A specific kind of knowledge, or a specific kind of tiredness, that looked like the residue of having understood something completely that had previously only been partially understood. The engagement had cost him. It had cost Muur something too. Though what it costs a compressed consciousness to be directly engaged by the most powerful force-sensitive it has ever encountered is not something any record could accurately describe. On the 6th day, the talisman stopped working. This is the plainest way to describe what happened, and it is also the least complete. The talisman did not break. It was not physically destroyed by any conventional means. What happened was something in the force, an act or a process, or a consequence of the 4-day engagement between Cade's direct refusal and Muur's 5,000-year investment in possession that emptied the metal. The compression that had held Muur's consciousness since 5000 BB released. Not explosively. Not with any dramatic visible manifestation that the surviving accounts describe in terms of light or sound or physical impact. It released the way a held breath releases, with the specific quality of something that had been sustained by continuous effort stopping, and everything that the effort had been sustaining dispersing into the surrounding force. Karness Muur, who had refused to die in the way Sith Lords died, violently, and not entirely at their own choosing, died in the way that everything eventually dies. Gradually, then completely, then gone. The talisman, emptied, was a piece of dark metal. Cade Skywalker set it down on the ground. He did not look at it again. What it was, in the moment he set it down, was this: small, flat on one side, slightly convex on the other, dark metal from a dead star system, cut and shaped by a man who had been dead for 5,000 years. Cold to the touch. Colder than the ambient temperature of the ground it sat on. Colder than the air above it. The same specific cold it had always had. The cold that Torvin Sess had noted in a documentation log 118 years earlier on a Coruscant cataloging desk, and that every person who had touched it directly had registered, and none of them had been able to fully explain. The cold did not leave when Muur left. It was a property of the metal, not of the presence that had been inside it. The metal was still the metal. The dead star it had come from was still dead. The cold was still the cold. There was a crack along the upper face, fine, precise, running from one edge approximately a third of the way across the surface. It had been there since a nameless acolyte on a nameless world had collapsed, and the talisman had struck stone approximately 4,800 years ago. The crack had not healed in 4,800 years, and it did not heal now. It was part of what the talisman was, had been part of it for longer than any specific owner had held it, longer than the Jedi Order in its current form had existed, longer than the Republic whose successor states were now contesting the galaxy's future. The crack was older than most things. There were fine lines of discoloration across the surface, faint, visible only in direct light, running in the specific patterns of long-term force contact. 118 years of Celeste Morn's suppressive presence had left these marks, not damage, not degradation, The physical record of a sustained force interaction, pressed into the metal the way weather presses into stone, slowly, invisibly, until one day you look closely and the record is there. She had not meant to mark it. She had simply held it for a very long time, and very long times mark things. The cord was still intact. It had been replaced twice in the talisman's history, once by Morn after the original cord degraded, once during the century of her carrying it. But the cord that was currently attached was the same one that had been there when Cade put it on. It lay in a loose coil beside the talisman on the ground. Karness Muur had made the talisman because he understood that everything ends, and he had decided that he was an exception. He was not an exception. He had delayed the end by 5,000 years through a specific and extraordinary application of Sith alchemy and patience, and the specific compressed intelligence of a man who had spent 11 years designing a container for the most important thing he had ever tried to preserve. He had outlasted the Sith Empire that produced him. He had outlasted the Republic that his exile had preceded. He had outlasted the Jedi Order of his era, and the Jedi Order of Celeste Morn's era, and every iteration of the Jedi and the Sith that had come between those 2 points and after them. He had outlasted the names of most of the worlds he had ever set foot on. He had outlasted the languages that had described him in the texts where he was described. He had not outlasted a Skywalker. This is not, in the logic of the talisman story, a statement about the Skywalker line's superiority to Karness Muur. It is a statement about accumulation. The talisman had been accumulating the galaxy's history on its surface for 5,000 years, accumulating owners and wars and gaps and silences, and the specific weight of every hand that had held it, and every sealed chamber it had waited in. Everything it had survived had become part of it. By the time it reached Cade Skywalker, it was not the object Muur had made. It was the object Muur had made plus 4,000 years of compression, plus the crack from the nameless acolyte, plus Celeste Morn's century of marks, plus the warmth of Darth Vader's gloved hand on the oubliette's outer casing, plus Torvin Sess's 4 minutes of careful ordinary attention, plus the bombardment of Taris that it had not registered, plus the 3,945 years of waiting in the dark that it had not experienced. It was all of that. It had always been all of that. What Cade Skywalker ended was not just Karness Muur. He ended the accumulated weight of 5,000 years of an object that had been built to survive everything and had, finally, encountered the one thing it could not outlast. The ground where the talisman was set down was on a world whose name the available records include, but whose significance in the broader galactic context is minor. It was not Taris. It was not Coruscant. It was not a world whose history intersected with the talismans at any previous point. It was simply the world where the last thing happened, chosen by the logic of events rather than by any symbolic resonance. The talisman sat on the ground. No one picked it up. Not immediately. Not in the hours that followed, during which the events that had produced the ending resolved themselves in the way that events resolve after the central thing has been decided, messily, incompletely, with the specific trailing quality of consequences finding their rest. People moved through the area. Some of them passed close to where the talisman lay. None of them touched it. Whether this was because they sensed something about it, or because they were too occupied with other things, or because the small dark piece of metal on the ground did not look like anything worth picking up, the records do not say. What the records say is that when the area was subsequently examined, the talisman was there. Cold, still, inert, the crack along its upper face unchanged, the discoloration marks unchanged, the cord in its loose coil unchanged. An object that had spent 5,000 years being the most significant thing in any room it occupied was now, for the first time, simply a thing on the ground. There is no word in any language spoken in the galaxy for what the talisman was after Cade Skywalker set it down. All the words that had ever been used for it, talisman, artifact, relic, weapon, container, vessel, carried the implication of something that did or held or meant. Those words required the presence that had been inside it. Without the presence, the words did not fully apply. It was a piece of metal, dark, cold, cracked, marked. Old in a way that very few physical objects in the galaxy were old. Not old because it had survived, but old because it had been built to survive and had done exactly what it was built to do for exactly as long as the thing that had built it had managed to sustain the building. The maker was gone. The object remained. For now. Metal corrodes. Eventually, even metal treated with Sith alchemy. Even metal from a dead star system shaped by a man who had spent 18 months pressing the dark side into its structure. Everything corrodes eventually. Everything ends eventually in the way that Karness Muur had understood and had built against and had in the end been right about. Everything ends. He had been right about that. He had been wrong about himself. The talisman sat on the ground of a minor world at the edge of the Legacy era, in the year 137 AB, which was 5,137 years after it had been made on a world that still did not have a name that any current map would recognize. It was small. It was cold. It had a crack along its upper face, and marks from a century of a woman's hands, and the weight of everything it had been pressed into its structure at a level that no scanner currently in use could fully measure. No one was coming for it. Not today. Not because it had no history. Because it had too much. Because the history was finished. And finished things have a quality that unfinished things do not. A specific stillness. The stillness of something that has arrived at its end and is simply present in that arrival, without urgency, without the forward lean of things that are still becoming. The talisman was not becoming anything. It had been. It had become. The becoming was done. On a cold world, in a minor location, in the year that a Skywalker finally ended what another Skywalker's presence had accelerated. What a Jedi shadow operative's century of endurance had made possible. What an Imperial archivist's 4 minutes of careful ordinary work had preserved. What a bombardment had failed to destroy. What 4,000 years of sealed dark had not diminished. The small dark piece of metal sat on the ground. That is what it was, at the end. That is what it had always been, underneath everything else. A small, cold, cracked piece of dark metal, carrying the shape of everything it had survived, on a ground that did not know what it was resting on. The galaxy continued above it. The talisman did not notice. It never had.